In just a moment, you are going to hear about one of the most controversial topics of our time. Now, I chose to hold this conversation because after the horrific massacre of October 7th, it seemed that there was a fog about who was right and who was wrong. Now, I'd like to think, and most of us do, I'm sure, that we can tell right from wrong. But if you look at the sweep of history, most of us can't do that. Well, we thought slavery was okay, and we were wrong. Turns out that when the powers that be decide they don't want us to like a certain group, they're pretty good at influencing us. In George Orwell's 1984, the Ministry of Truth tells us war is peace, freedom is slavery. What if our ministers of truth, the universities, the politicians, the media, have all brainwashed us? What if this thing that we're told is a Middle East peace process is really a war process? What if the Middle East conflict is really one side seeking peaceful coexistence with its neighbors and the rest of the world, and another side that has genocidal impulses and since the beginning has attempted to exterminate its neighbors? Can you really have something called a cycle of violence when if on one side you had Arabs who, if they decided to give up their weapons today, tomorrow there would be peace, and the other side, Israelis, who if they gave up their weapons today, tomorrow there would be no Israel? What if the war that started Israel wasn't the cause of the Arab-Israeli conflict, but the result of an attempt by Arab states to exterminate the Jews living in what's now Israel? Can you have peace when your enemy is resolved not to make peace with you? As we go through the conversation ahead, I want you to consider one more thing. Throughout the Arab world, about 1 million Jews were dispossessed from their homes and from their businesses. There was persecution of the Jews throughout the Arab countries. They had their cemeteries desecrated or just completely obliterated. Their landmarks were removed. Their entire cultures were erased. Yet you've never heard of the Jews mobilizing, of Israelis mobilizing for a right of return to the Arab world, for reasons that will, if they're not already obvious, become obvious in this discussion. Yet we are told that there is an Arab right of return to Israel. And until Israel grants that right of return, Israel is guilty. Let's cut through the fog and get into this conversation.
We are here to discuss what many people in the world consider the most unsolvable problem, and that is the Arab-Israeli conflict. Now, you two are both professors, and you wrote a book, The Classical Liberal Case for Israel, that drops a 2-ton neutron bomb on the fallacies most people hold about this issue. Where do we begin? Most people seem to fault the Jews living in Israel, or those who founded Israel, because they should have known that they were going to anger their Arab neighbors when they created the state of Israel. So, how about we start there? Why is the state of Israel located where it is?
Jews were in the area 2,000 years ago. That's why it was called Judea. And that is why there has always been Jewish presence in the area, except for specific periods in history, like the Crusades, where Jews were massacred. The relevant thing is that as Jews were expelled fundamentally by the Romans 2,000 years ago, they never lost hope of getting back. Their entire religion, their entire culture grew as an ideal to go back to Zion and to have Zion as its ultimate goal. What is Zion? Jerusalem. It's Judea. It's the land of Israel. So why is Israel placed there? That's the answer. Because Jews got back to their land. Now, what was the status of the area? As the Jews were expelled by the Romans, the land in the year 135 of the Common Era was labeled by the Romans as Syria Palestina, Palestine. That's where the name appeared. So it's a historical land that includes also what now is Jordan and other parts surrounding the modern state of Israel. Now, What was the status of the land at the end of the 19th century? Well, it was an almost unpopulated area. By 1890, it had about, let's say, about 400,000 Muslims and about 45,000 Jews in an area that now has more than 9 million people living as citizens in the state of Israel. 3 million people living in Judea and Samaria, otherwise known as the West Bank, which is the West Bank of the Jordan River. That's why it's called like that. And 2 million people in Gaza. So you could easily see that it was almost unpopulated. It was underdeveloped. It was mainly a desert. The Jews decided that they wanted to go back for real. And that is why Zionism, in different types of forms, such as political Zionism, that wanted to get political support for the establishment of a Jewish state in the area. Then you have socialist Zionism that basically was focused in working the land and creating these kibbutzim, which were basically agricultural communities. And then you have a classical liberal Zionism, which was the revisionist movement. The main thing is that through several immigration waves, Jews got back to the land. And by the year 1947, 1948, there were 600,000 Jews and about 1.1 million Arabs. The reason there was no Jewish majority at the time the State of Israel was born is because the British severely restricted Jewish immigration to the land of Israel. This is easily shown because by the end of the 50s, Israel's population tripled. If Jews would have been able to go to Palestine, to immigrate from Europe, they would surely have chosen that path instead of being slaughtered in the Holocaust by Nazi Germany.
I wanted to answer the question in a slightly different way. The question is, why is Israel located where it is? I wanted to answer a slightly different question. I'm a professor. I'm never supposed to answer any question directly. I'm supposed to prevaricate, and I'll do that now. And I'll ask, why are Jews located where they are? And my answer is, Jews are located where they are based on who kicked them out and whether they can fight to defend themselves and whether they have a host who is welcoming them. For example, there were once 1 billion Jews in Syria and Egypt, Iraq and Iran and all the countries around Israel. And they were mostly made unwelcome. And they were kicked out. And everyone talks about the right of return. You know, the Palestinian Arabs should have their return when they left in 48. Very few people talk about the Jews should have their land back in Egypt and all these other surrounding countries. They wanted to get into Canada in the 30s, and the Canadian authorities were asked, well, how many Jews would you allow? And the answer was, none is too many. A very famous quote from a Canadian person in charge of immigration into Canada. None is too many. So for a while, you couldn't have any Jews in Canada. I'm Jewish. Right now, I happen to be in Canada. There are other Jews here. But to answer the question, where are Jews? We are wherever we can have a foothold and not be kicked out. We would have been happy to stay in Germany in the 30s, but it was not a very welcoming situation, as Alan alluded to. So there are very few Jews in Germany. They're not that welcome in France anymore. So a lot of French Jews are emigrating to either Brooklyn or Israel, mostly Israel. So the question is to why Israel, because in 1948 they could fight back for the first time, perhaps, in many areas and many countries. That's why they're in Israel, because they could fight back.
Possession is 9/10 of the law. How does someone come to own a piece of land?
We adhere to John Locke. John Locke was a famous philosopher, not Jewish, but he had a Jüdische cup, as they say. And what he said is the way you get to own anything is by possessing it. As you say, possession is 9/10 of the law. We start with ourselves. I own this body. Josh, you own that body. Alan, you own that body because you possessed it. And now that you own yourselves, what you do is you go to virgin land and you mix your labor with the land. and I clear some land and I put in a corn crop and I now own the land and I own the corn. Alan domesticates a cow and he now owns the cow. And what happens is a secondary way of owning stuff is homesteading and then any legitimate title transfer. So I now barter with Alan and I now own the milk, even though I didn't produce the milk. He did. And he owns the corn, even though he didn't produce the corn, because we each created the milk and the corn. I the corn and the milk, but then we traded. And now I own the milk and he owns the corn. So any legitimate title transfer after initiation of homesteading with the land.
Alan, anything you want to add to that?
Well, in the particular case of Israel, the fundamental myth against Israel, there are two, but the most important one is that Israel is based on massive expropriation and theft, land theft, and ethnic cleansing. But the ethnic cleansing part is, it's ultimately an aspect of the expropriation and the land theft. So actually, this is fundamentally a charge based on property rights. So although the conflict could be understood in different terms, because the conflict, if you could call it a conflict, it's based on property rights. Although, as I said, the real issue here is that there is a rejection of any Jewish presence in the area, particularly in the form of a state, which is why there were massacres of Jews way back before the state of Israel was even born. But if we are going to see the argument is of property rights. And briefly, what we could say is that there was no entity, political entity, before 1948 called State of Palestine. There was no Palestinian sovereignty in the area, if you understand Palestinian as Palestinian Arab, because before the State of Israel was born, both Jews and Arabs of Palestine were called Palestinians. You could say they were Arabs from Palestine, Palestinian Arabs, and you had also Palestinian Jews. For the last 500 years, before World War I, you had the Ottoman Empire, and then you had the British. No Palestinian Arab entity there. So who owned the land? Most of the land was owned by the government. And if you're going to see the land categories of property according to Ottoman law, you see that what we regard as private property in a Western sense was a very little percentage of the total land. Most of the land was owned by the government. And the other thing that we found out by doing our research for the book is what Walter just said. You had, in order for something to be legitimately your property, you have to homestead it. In the case of land, you have to grow something in the land. You have to work the land. Now, how do we know that most of the land that was owned by Arabs nominally was illegitimately owned? Well, because it was regarded as uncultivable. Hence, we know it was not cultivated, so it was not homesteaded. Most of the land, it's not only the case that was owned by the government, but most of the land that was owned by Arabs was not legitimately owned by them because there were government concessions mainly. Jews bought titles to land from governments, from private individuals, from absentee landowners, from Arab leaders. And they bought the land, not because they thought, the Jews, that these were legitimately, kosher titles. They did it because it was the only way to acquire land legally in order to work the land later, which is what they did. So basically what the Jews got, they homesteaded. So how much land are we talking about here? Well, let's say between 9 and 11% of the land was owned by Jews and homesteaded by Jews. And then you have about 3% owned by Israeli Arabs. And then you have about 16% of the land, to the best estimates, that was owned by Arabs. Now remember, most of it was not legitimately owned because it was not homesteaded. But then what happened with the rest of the land? That's 70% of the land. That's a lot. It was owned by government. It was owned by no one. So it's not the case that the Jews stole the land. They purchased a part of the land, and they built the state of Israel.
How much of the land do you believe should have been owned by Israelis, I should say by Jews, and how much of the land should have been owned by non-Jews when the state of Israel came into existence?
Now, there are certain places, and we make the case in the book, for specific cases that should go to Jews without any question, which, for example, is the Temple Mount, because that was the most important, most sacred place of Judaism. We know it was built by Jews, particularly by a specific category of Jews, which are the Kohanim. But the point is, history matters, which is why some people say, they say, well, you're trying to make a case for Israel based on something that happened 2,000 years ago, of which you have very little evidence. Well, you do have very little evidence of homesteading in most of the land, but you have evidence of Jewish homesteading in specific key places of the land, because those key places explain why Jews wanted to go back. One of those places is the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. And the fact that history is so important is what explains why often Palestinian propaganda tries to say that they are the real Jews in a sense. They say Jesus was a Palestinian. They say that they have been there forever and ever. And why do they say that? Because history matters. The land that should have been Jewish, you could say that at minimum, that which was purchased, homesteaded by Jews, and that you had evidence that it was homesteaded by Jews in the past. It means perhaps that you would have ended with the state of Israel with the amount of land closely resembling that was allotted to it in the partition plan in 1947, which was based mainly on demographic considerations. That is where Jews had the majority. And if you were not satisfied with the John Lockean status of the land, you could perhaps made a swap with the Arab state that was never born because they rejected it. So there were many different ways that you could actually make this work. The point is that it was never the goal of Israel's enemies to say, okay, you could have a state here because you homesteaded the land. I mean, the Arab states were not being moved by the arguments of libertarianism or classical liberalism when they decided to attack Israel and try to kill every Jew in the area. So
it's sort of like a two-sided coin. On the one hand, the dispute is land, and the Arabs, Palestinian Arabs, claim that the land is theirs, and the Jews claim the land is ours. And I think that our side is much more justified because of homesteading, whereas in their aspect, homesteading is irrelevant. And the other side, as Alan alluded to, was hatred of Jews. Because before the establishment of Israel in 1948, there were pogroms and violence against Jews, like in Hebron in 1929. And this is long before the establishment of the State of Israel. So it's not just land, and it's not just hatred of Jews, it's both. Another point I wanted to make in terms of homesteading, when did Jews start? We started around 3,000 years ago. When did the Islam religion start? About 700 AD. So the Jews have been around about twice as long as the others. Namely, we've had more time to homestead than they have. So if there's there are really two issues. One is, historically, what was going on 2,000 years ago? And we were there, they were not. The second one is what was happening in the more modern era. And as Ellen mentioned, we were mixing our labor with the land. They were not. The credit that they took the land was swamp and desert, which means uncultivatable and uncultivated. But yet the criteria for just ownership of land is cultivation or mixing your labor with the land. So on both aspects, I think we Jews or the Israelis get the nod vis-a-vis the Palestinian Arabs, both 2,000 years ago and in the more modern 100 years ago or 150 years ago. Now, you might say, well, the situation 2,000 years ago is irrelevant because you can't go back that far. Well, we can go back that far, but we do better than the Arabs. So is there the claim that the Jewish claim to land is perfect? No, not perfect. Certainly not from 2,000 years ago. But the issue is, which is a better claim? Look, if you're the judge, Josh, and Alan and I are having a dispute as to who owns something, and Alan's case is better than mine, but imperfect, the nod goes to Alan. So perfection is the enemy of the good. We're not going to have nothing perfect here. But the Jewish claims are better in many ways that Alan alluded to.
There are about 1.8 billion Muslims. There are about 18 million Jews. If there's some innate hostility toward the Jews, then it's hard for a lot of people to hold out too much hope, because that is a pretty big imbalance. But you're suggesting, Walter, it's not some underlying hostility alone. It is actually a dispute over land as well. Both are happening. If it were a dispute over land, would you have expected that by now, one of the sets of concessions, one of the very generous negotiations would have worked out?
Well, yes, if it was just a matter of land, and they adhere to a libertarian or a classical liberal conception of land, then yes. But the hatred goes against that. There are two parties, and one party is 1%, the other is 99%, and therefore the implication is that the 99% will prevail. Let me give you an example where it didn't prevail. When the conquistadores from Spain went over to the West and North America and South America, there were just a couple of hundred of them. And they beat in warfare tens of thousands of other people. Well, why? Were they stronger physically? Not really stronger physically, but they had guns and armor, whereas the other guys just had bows and arrows and no armor. Namely, when a first world country fights a third world country, the outcome does not depend upon mere numbers, although numbers are not irrelevant, but they're not crucial. Well, Israel is a first world country. Who was involved in the creation of the atom bomb, which was a new weapon in, in the 40s? Well, Jews were disproportionately involved there. Jews are disproportionately involved in Nobel Prizes in math and physics and stuff like that. If there's a war between a first world country and a whole bunch of third world countries, the nod does not necessarily go to the numerous group. The nod sometimes, often, goes to the first world country. Look, if Israel were fighting its battle with both arms, there'd be no question of months of war. The war would be over in 5 minutes or in 6 days or whatever it is. The problem is Israel is fighting with the 1.5 arms behind its back because it's so worried about public opinion in Europe and public opinion in the U.S. It's so worried about what is Biden going to say. You know, they say that the Israel military is the fourth most powerful in the whole world after the U.S., China, and Russia. I'm not so sure about that. The U.S. Army is now woke. And, when you have a woke army, it's not an efficient army. The Russian army is having trouble in Ukraine. And the Chinese army is, if they were so good, they would have taken over Taiwan. One might even make the case that the Israeli army is the most powerful army in the world. I'm not sure about that. This is a very controversial issue. But certainly the Israeli army, compared to the Egyptian army or the Jordanian army or Iraqi army, I don't think we have to worry that much about Israel if they're able to fight with both hands and not with the 1 3/4 arms tied behind its back, worried about world opinion.
It is not the case that there is, I don't think at least, that there is an innate animosity against the Jewish state by every Muslim in the world or by Arab countries as such. Now, this is an empirical fact because Israel has peace treaties with Jordan, with Egypt. Now it has with United Arab Emirates and other Arab countries and Muslim countries. So, not the case. Now, what is the difference, you may ask? Well, the difference is that if you identify the conflict as a conflict of property rights, which is how it is usually presented in the West, you would follow the proposed solution by the Israeli left and right, which is lands for peace, from the Oslo Accords in 93. And, until, let's say, 2010, 2009, something along those dates. The idea was, okay, so we give land back to the Palestinian Authority, which, by the way, it's the only time in history that Palestinian Arabs had any sort of self-government, which is when Israel allowed them to create the Palestinian Authority in 93. And you say, well, so you give back land, or you give land away, and therefore you allow them to build their own country with their own property, that is, with their own land, and that's it. Lands for peace. Well, because this is a misunderstanding of the root of the conflict, which is the rejection of the Jews in the area as Jews, and specifically as a Jewish state, this was never going to be a solution. Quite the opposite. When you, for example, give the Gaza Strip to the Palestinian Authority in 2005, as Prime Minister Sharon did, with the idea that they will begin to build their own state, the Palestinian state, and they will build, let's say, a type of Hong Kong or Singapore in Gaza that has amazing beaches next to the Mediterranean, and well, you name it. You could do many great things there. Instead of that, they chose Hamas, that is the people, the Palestinian Arabs, they chose Hamas in elections. And Hamas kicked the Palestinian Authority out of the Gaza Strip, began to control it and to govern it de facto, right? And they used the Gaza Strip as a staging ground to launch tens of thousands of rockets to Israeli civilians. So, and what was the problem? Again, that although it is presented as a conflict, as a property rights conflict, this is actually a genocidal impulse, a genocidal intent on the part of Israel's enemies that want to kill the Jews, as we saw on October the 7th. Now, it's quite difficult for people in the West to understand genocidal intent, because it's been decades since we saw it on the West, since the end of World War II, to be more specific. So it's very difficult for people to understand what's going on. But in the Middle East, this is something that's quite normal. And this is the root of the conflict. So to get to your comment and to your question, lands for peace is not going to work. It didn't work, and it won't work, because the root of the conflict is the rejection of the Jews in the area, particularly of a Jewish state. So how is it that Arab states agreed to make peace with Israel? It's because they understood that no military operation on the part of any state or group of states is going to destroy the Jewish state. And so once they see that they cannot win in the sense of destroying, they say, okay, so we have to accept the situation and let's move on. We accept the Jewish state, which is what Iran and its proxies in Lebanon, for example, Hezbollah, and in Hamas, in the Gaza Strip, actually do not accept, which is why they continue.
How does secession work? And has that been an option for Arabs? Palestinian Arabs?
They had the chance many times in the 30s, in the 40s, in the 60s, in the 70s, in the 90s. In 2000, Prime Minister Barak offered Arafat the best offer they could ever get, basically. The entire Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, half of Jerusalem, and also money by international, aid. And they said no. So what did they get from the Oslo Accords? They got a self-government, a sort of self-government in specific areas. For example, in Judea and Samaria and in the Gaza Strip. the Palestinian National Authority. So they do have some sort of self-government, because most of the Palestinian Arabs are under the jurisdiction of either Hamas or the Palestinian National Authority, which is, most people don't know about this. They think that Israel controls the entire area, and it's not the case. It militarily controls the area in Judea and Samaria, not in Gaza. Well, now, yes, right, after the incursion, but it wasn't the case before October the 7th. If there would have been, let's say, a Jewish state in the entire area, and they would have wanted to secede, of course there is a right to secession, because people have the right to, associate voluntarily and peacefully with whatever they want. But there is no such a thing as a right to establish a dictatorship. And there is no such thing as a right to establish a dictatorship in order to destroy you. So, what happened in Gaza? There was, in effect, a coup by Hamas that established a pseudo-state from which they had the goal of destroying the state of Israel. You could say, well, they would have never achieved this, you name it, but they killed 1,200 people just a few months ago. And if they would have the chance to do it, they would do it again and kill more people. So, do they have a right to form that kind of state? Absolutely no. I think this is quite something that's it's reasonable to say, yes, you have the right to build your own state, your own life on the classical liberal framework, to respect individual rights, but you don't have the right to establish a dictatorship, because a dictatorship is at war first with the citizens it controls, and then with the neighbors. So secession, yes, but dictatorships as a result of secessions, no. That's the answer.
They had the control since 2005 from us, and they built tunnels, all sorts of tunnels underground. And instead of building tunnels, they could have built salt salinization factories. They could have built roads. They could have tried to become the Hong Kong of the Middle East. And what they did is they put rocket launchers right in the middle of schools, right in the middle of mosques, right in the middle of hospitals. And they would shoot rockets over to Israel. And then when Israel tried to stop the rockets and destroy the hospital or destroy the mosque or destroy the school, somehow world opinion was against Israel. It's interesting that on October 8th, one day after the incursion of October 7th, before Israel did anything, people in the West at Harvard had 35 student groups saying that this is all the fault of Israel. And this is before the IDF did anything. This is before the IDF started bombing hospitals. Before they bomb, they usually send leaflets. But what other country in the world ever sends leaflets anywhere? The U.S. never sent any leaflets to Hiroshima or Dresden. They send leaflets and they try to not have too much collateral damage. But is the IDF perfect? But this is not the fault of the IDF. This is the fault of people who use their own citizens or their own countrymen as shields. Look, if I come into a bank and I have a shield right in front of me and I start shooting, and they can't shoot back because I have a shield, well, I'm going to get away with murder. The Israelis cannot allow that. And then there's the other issue that even the Palestinian Arabs would rather be run by Israel than run by their own leaders. If you're a homosexual, certainly in Gaza and also in many of the other Arab countries, they'll just throw you off the roof. In Israel, they have gay parades and they have gay marriages and stuff like that. Women are allowed to drive. All women, Palestinian women as well as Israeli women in Israel. But in other countries, they're not allowed to drive. This is a third world country, not only in terms of military ability, but in terms of civilization. Israel is one of the civilized countries in the Middle East.
Why don't Israelis have more conviction or more clarity around how wrong this idea of a Palestinian state is? We often hear them advocating for a two-state solution. I was in Israel recently, and our guide started yelling at me as I was driving. Whoa, whoa, whoa! Do not turn there. We will be killed if you go down that road. So what do you mean? He said, read that sign. I looked up. If you are Israeli, there is a good chance you will be killed. And there are signs like that all over. If you take a wrong turn into the wrong neighborhood. Now, here in America, that wouldn't fly. Some people become so acculturated to wrong-headed ideas, to bad actors, to evil, that these things can persist. Have they just grown used to it? Why do they tolerate so much hate and welcome it with a state, like you said, that would be a dictatorship sworn to their destruction?
A lot of people are saying, well, yes, the Arabs did wrong, but, they've been so brutalized by the Israelis. They wouldn't be brutalized if they were peaceful. Bibi Netanyahu once had a very famous statement that I repeat over and over again, and said, if the Arabs disarmed, there'd be peace. If the Israelis disarmed, there'd be no more Israel. They say that Israel is brutalizing them by putting up fences and putting up gates and not allowing Gazans into the country without inspections and in all sorts of ways ruining their lives. Well, why are the Israelis doing that? Because they've been murdered by these other people. Again, if there was no murder, mass murder, rockets coming in Israel, if there were peace, Israel wouldn't restrict the people from Gaza from coming into work any more than Canada restricts Americans from coming into work, or vice versa. There's peace between Canada and the U.S. But suppose that there were rockets fired from Toronto into New York, or from British Columbia into Seattle. Well, now the U.S., being more powerful than Canada, would look askance at Canadians, would be very careful about Canadians, would watch out for Canadians if the Canadians were doing to the Americans what the Palestinian Arabs were doing to the Israelis. If they would just stop and become peaceful, they wouldn't be brutalized, quote around brutalized, namely inspected and put fences around, and in other ways had their lives interfered with. You have to ask who started the fight. They started the fight. And if they stopped the fight, there'd be no fight. Whereas if the Israelis stopped the fight, there'd be no Israel.
The Israeli mindset is for peace. So people want to find a solution to the problem because they want to live lives worth living. Not going to the army, not being drafted. They want to focus on their business and to their families and their friends and to live a good life. Anyone who knows Israelis know that this is the case. No one is enjoying going to the IDF. They do it because they have to do it, otherwise they get killed. So what happened was that they saw that some of their neighbors accepted the existence of Israel, just like Jordan, just like Egypt. And so they said, why not Palestinian Arabs? Well, the problem is that they don't want a state. They want the state. They want the state of Israel. That's the main problem here. At least some of their neighbors don't want to live in peace with them. This is a terrible fact that needs to be acknowledged, and I think most Israelis, even extreme left-wing Israelis, have acknowledged since October the 7th. And I'm just going to add one more thing. Tens of thousands of Palestinian Arabs got into Israel through checkpoints that are built in order to stop terrorist attacks. These tens of thousands of Palestinian Arabs got into Israel to work every day from Judea and Samaria, that is the West Bank, and from the Gaza Strip. There were about 20,000 work permits for people in Gaza to go to Israel, into Israel to work. Now, we don't know if some of them, most of them, or all of them collaborated with Hamas in order to gather intelligence of information and data that was later used in order to act on October the 7th. But many of them actually did. And so the question is, what can you do? You try to help people by giving them work. Well, first you give them the property that was owned by Jews that lived in Gaza. So you expel your own citizens, violating their property rights, their individual rights. Then you give them control of the Gaza Strip. What do? They destroy some of the property, and they use the area as a staging ground for terrorist operations. And then what do? In order to to continue with this, you try to give them, some of them, work permits. And then you find out that those people that were working and were ultimately helping 100,000 people in Gaza because of that work that you gave them in Israel, were actually working for Hamas in order to gather information, intelligence, to kill the very same people that were giving them work and jobs and incomes. So, I mean, what can you do in this context? You have to recognize reality, that these people want you killed, and it does not depend on you. We say this in the book. There's a chapter that we say this specifically. There's a syllogism, and you say, you make peace with your enemy. The problem is that this logical structure is wrong, because you make peace with your enemy as long as your enemy wants to make peace with you. It takes two to tango, right? So here, X doesn't want to make peace with you. He wants to kill you. So what do? You have to fight back. There's no other way.
Framing this is so important. You suggest the term the Arab-Israeli conflict is actually a misnomer, because it's not really two-sided, as you're pointing out. One side is aggressing against the other. When I talk to most people about the grievances, they point back to the founding of Israel. Now, was Israeli acquisition of what we now call Israel, was that actually the cause of the Arab war against Israelis? Or was it more the result of the Arab war against the Israelis?
Absolutely correct. The second part, that is, if the Arabs would have accepted the UN partition plan, the state of Israel would have been much smaller than it is. And it would have included big desert in the south, the Negev. There was nothing there at the time, and there is almost nothing there today. So, I mean, it was not that the Arabs were being scammed or anything like that, because also they had another state in the area, 2/3 of the entire area, to be more precise, which is Jordan. So it would have been the second Arab state. Yes, they launched, that is, Arab states, Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq. They launched, and others that sent small numbers of combatants. They launched the genocidal war against the Jewish state. They lost. As a result, they lost land. And if you aggress, then the victim has a right to more, because that's how justice works.
Is there a moral basis for conceding territory to those who aggress and attempt to exterminate or otherwise vanquish you?
In every case that you will find that there was eventually a swap, a goodwill swap of lands later, afterwards, a war, you would see that both sides wanted to reach an agreement. And we saw this in the case of Israel. When Israel gave back the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt, which was 2 times its size. So Israel has never had any problem in giving back land in exchange for peace. But the problem is that it's not always because of land. It's not always land that's the main issue.
So I think, Josh, you're absolutely right. It's not just the libertarian issue. You can come up with all sorts of examples. For example, when Germany lost the First World War, they lost, Alsace-Lorraine and the Sudetenland and a few other German possessions that went to France or Poland or somewhere else. Another example is the war between the United States and Mexico. They lost Texas. Look, suppose Canada had a war and Canada was the bad guy and they initiated the war against the U.S. And at the end of the war, the U.S. occupied British Columbia. Do you think they'd give it back? Maybe, but maybe not. And it wouldn't be a libertarian issue. It would be that, kind of the start of the war, the U.S. wanted, and during the war, we, for some reason, occupied British Columbia. Well, now British Columbia is the 51st state. On the Sinai, I think I might disagree with Alan a little bit here, but my understanding is that the reason Israel gave back the Sinai was Eisenhower. Eisenhower forced them to do it, saying, we're going to kick your butt if you don't give it back. I think Israel would have been entirely justified to keep the Sinai, and the greater Israel should have been triple the size of it is now, because the Sinai is roughly double the size of greater Israel. And it was due to Eisenhower. And I think Eisenhower once said after he retired that was one of his biggest mistakes, to compel Israel to give back the Sinai. But the point is, Egypt started that war. And at the end of the war, Israel occupied the Sinai. And there's plenty of precedent for Israel to have kept the Sinai. And I would say that if there's ever a war between Israel and Egypt again, God forbid, and Israel ends up occupying the Sinai again after that war, Israel should absolutely not give it back, no matter what the U.S. says.
What Walter just mentioned was in the 1956 war. And yes, Eisenhower pressed Israel in order to give it back. And then you had the case of 67, the Six-Day War. Egypt took many steps that were actually war declarations against Israel, closing the Straits of Tiran and many others. And so basically what happened then was, at the end of the war, a few days later, Israel got to control the Sinai Peninsula, and at the end of the 70s, it gave it back to Egypt in exchange for peace. The main thing is that I'm trying to focus on what Israel is willing to do in exchange for peace, and we can see until this point that there has been peace with Egypt. So you could say, well, I mean, it was not in the interest of Israel to keep the Sinai Peninsula, but it was in the interest of Israel to achieve peace with Egypt. So basically, yes, although as a result of this defensive war, would Israel have been entitled to keep the Sinai Peninsula? Yes.
Do the Palestinians have valid grievances?
I think that in any war is hell, innocents fall in every war, and they get screwed, as you said, Josh, in every war. So you could actually make a case that injustices were done because of the war, because war is terrible. But the problem is, who is responsible for the war? And it was Arab states, Arab leaders. So if there is anyone that they should go to complain, is their own leaders, their own leadership. And as a result of that, what have they done with the Palestinian Arabs? They left them with the status of refugees for decades in order to use them as pawns to attack the state of Israel. And at the same time, they denied citizenship to them in many places in the Arab world. At the same time, the state of Israel recognized many complaints by specific Palestinian Arabs, and tens of thousands were allowed to return in family reunification programs in Israel and in Judea and Samaria and Gaza. Not hundreds of thousands as they demand, but tens of thousands. And there were complaints that were answered by Israeli courts. But the most important thing is that Israel has had an Arab citizenry from its beginning, about 150,000 that are now 2 million. And so what does that say? It says that it was never in the intention of Israeli leaders to ethnically cleanse all Arabs or to avoid having Arab citizens in Israel. They are part of the state of Israel today. Some of them are in the army defending the state of Israel. And that's the main thing. So you have to distinguish the Arabs that stayed in Israel from the Arabs that left Israel, because fundamentally there is no intention to achieve peace from the side of the Palestinian Arabs, as we discussed a while ago. And so you cannot be forced to accept hundreds of thousands of people that will likely have bad intentions against your citizens. No state would allow that. Why would the Jewish state allow that? In a state of war. In Israel proper, about 700,000 Arabs left as a result of the War of Independence in 1948-49. Most of them fled due to fear of war itself, and others were got in the middle of fighting, so they left as a result of fighting itself. In some specific cases, the IDF advanced, and so in order to fight, they had to do it in a way that affected people living in those places. So they went to other places nearby, or in some places, they were expelled from specific cities or areas, like, for example, Lida.
The way that I understood the story, I think from the way you told it in your book, started with a grand declaration around exterminating the Jews from the land. And that to me seemed like the 800-pound gorilla in the room. So if someone tells half of a population, we're going to exterminate the other half, clear out so we can do that, that seems to me like perhaps the most relevant kind of precursor to those who left. Do you want to perhaps paint that picture a little bit for what precipitated the departure? Because my understanding from your book is it wasn't just the incursion of IDF or of soldiers or fear of a war. It sounded like there was a grand plan issued from some type of leadership.
Yes, that is certainly the case, but it has to. That's why I'm trying to be extremely careful with the words I use. Most fled due to fear of war, and also they had the idea by their leadership, the Arab leadership, that this was going to be a very fast war, quick war, that's going to last very little. The Jews are going to be wiped out, and the Arabs will be able to get back to their houses and, with no Jews in the area anymore. Although this is the case, and although most Arabs fled due to fear of war and through, the ongoing fighting and the advance of the IDF and the retreat of the Arab armies as the war moved and developed, some were expelled because of defensive operations by the IDF in its advance, as in any other war. But remember, most fled due to fear. This is simply a fact. It's recognized by historians from any type. You could see also the new historians like Benny Morris, and you will find it. It's fear mainly that was the key factor that moved Arabs to get out of the area. Now, at the same time, you have to remember, Jews were afraid as well, but they didn't have any place to go. They had to stay and they had to fight. At the same time, you had 1 million Jews, Arab Jews, that were expelled from Iraq, from Yemen. I mean, they were expropriated massively. The value of their properties is likely several times that was equal to the value of property in the state of Israel proper at the time, and the same with respect to their land holdings. The land holdings of Arab Jews was several times that of the Jews in Israel. So, I mean, you could say, for example, okay, so if some Arabs were expelled due to the war of independence in Israel, you could say, well, you could do a swap, right? As a matter of justice, you could do a swap from what Arab states stole from Jews in order to compensate the Arabs that were harmed because of their actions. That is, the actions of the Arab leaders. So you could say, okay, we will compensate you. We'll make peace with Israel, and we'll compensate you with the property that we stole from the Jews. I think that Jews would agree to this trade, because after 70 years, most Jews got over it and they moved on with their lives, and they built new lives, more richer lives, more thriving lives in their own state. And the Palestinian Arabs are still being used by Israel's enemies in order to attack the state of Israel.
This sounds like an agency problem, because the Palestinian Arabs, as you mentioned, don't have agency over the decisions governing them. And it's those who don't have their best interest at heart that are the ones who exercise agency and dominion and are ultimately undermining them. Walter?
There were 5 Arab countries that attacked Israel in 1948. And before they attacked, they sent out messages to the Arabs living in what was later Israel. And the gist of those messages was, get out, go away. We will kick Israeli Jewish butt quickly. In a week or two, you'll come back and there'll be no Jews here. And they were aiding and abetting the Arab army. They were cooperating with the Arab armies. Yes, they were afraid. They were afraid that if they stayed, they'd be killed by the Arab armies. And the Arab armies wanted them out so that the only people left would be Jews, and you could just sort of rat-tat-tat, kill all the Jews. Whereas if there were Arabs still there, then the Arab armies would have had to be careful about who to kill, and that would have been a pain in the neck for them. Let's compare how the Arabs treated the Jews that were in Yemen and in Egypt and in Syria with how the other way around. What should have happened was some sort of swap. Namely, instead of the right of return of the hundreds of thousands of Arabs who left in 48, they should have taken over the Jewish areas in Egypt and in Jordan and in Syria and elsewhere. And look at how the two treated each other. Israel integrated all of the Jews from the Arab countries many years ago, whereas what the Arab countries did is they made those Palestinians stay in these camps. And yes, these camps were very bad, very harsh. And they were used as a sort of a pity to show that Israel is responsible for that. But no, Israel is not responsible for that. Look, right now, the Israeli army is bombing Gaza. And it, unfortunately, is killing innocent Palestinian Arabs, cousins. But whose fault is that? Well, the Hamas still have Jewish hostages. And as long as they have those hostages, as long as they haven't surrendered, Israel has but no choice but to deal with them. Otherwise, this will happen again. There is an expression in Israel called mowing the lawn. Every couple of years, the Gazans, the Hamas send over more rockets, and then the Israelis kick back, and then it stops. And this time, finally, Israel got some sense and says, look, this is not a good way to deal with the situation. We've got to get rid of Hamas, because Hamas is a genocidal killer, mass murderers. If they continue to exist, they'll just do this October 7th in 2 or 3 years from now. So we've got to get rid of them. And the only way to get rid of them is to have, unfortunately, people killed in the bombing. But whose fault is that? It is the fault of Hamas.
Just to make a quick summary, Josh. Cause and effect. You say, for example, most Arabs fled in 48 due to fear. Some were expelled because of the advance of the IDF. But cause and effect. If there would have been no genocidal war launched by Arab states, there would have been no instance of anybody fleeing due to fear or being expelled or being displaced. This is simply a fact.
It strikes me, in the lucidity you bring to this, that what we're told as a great paradox is actually very simple. The Arab-Israeli conflict, which you reframe as a series of wars of aggression, it seems so simple. It also seems somewhat paradoxical that libertarians en masse seem stacked up against the case for Israel. But as you walk through this, has there ever been a people as victimized by their overlords as the Palestinians? They basically have been thrown wholesale under the bus. If they had a copy of some tract on John Locke, on individual rights, on self-determination, and they could somehow manifest that, who on planet Earth would benefit more disproportionately than them? Let's continue resolving this conflict, or this paradox, because I think you're shining an extraordinarily illuminating light here. The United Nations, they're supposed to come in and clear the dust here. What have they done to address this conflict?
Well, let me just say about the UN, I'm not a real big fan of the UN. The UN is always criticizing Israel for things that they would never criticize any other countries. I think, what is it? The only standard that the UN has is a double standard, one for Israel and one for everybody else. Other countries accuse of way worse things without any problem. So I'm not a big fan of the UN on this issue.
Walk through the UN. What have they done to address this conflict?
Well, what they've done is muddied the waters and blamed Israel for just about everything. The UN is a joke. The UN is unfair. There's no justification here. The UN, I don't know, maybe Israel should leave the UN. I'm not sure about that. But in terms of justice and judicial analysis of this, the UN is just totally biased. There's only one Israeli state. How many Arab states are there? I don't know, about 20 or so. Well, they have 20 the times of the vote. Now, they're not 20 times more powerful. We discussed that before about First World and Third World. But they certainly have more votes. And then how many Arabs are there in France? More than Jews. How many are there in Europe, in the Scandinavian countries? More than there are Jews. So you're going to get a lot of people voting against Israel in the UN, and it's totally unfair.
The UN cannot be better than the sum of its members. So if you have an organization that's full of dictatorships, some of them with, regular dictatorships, some of them totalitarian, and you see the UN Human Rights Commission, who are part of the commission, Cuba, North Korea, Iran, then it's a joke. The entire thing it's a joke. It's quite telling that those people are voting against Israel. Because if they would vote in favor of Israel, you may ask the question of what is Israel doing wrong to be on the same side as North Korea, right? And basically, the UN it doesn't work, and it will never work because you cannot. The fundamental premise is that you want to create, as in the League of Nations, you want to create an international community, a forum for international community of countries, but if you're going to equate a totalitarian dictatorship, a communist dictatorship, religious fanatics with Western civilized industrial countries, then everything you're accomplishing is to diminish the the moral status of those Western countries when you put them in the same place of these other barbarians, basically. So, it's a joke.
How about the Palestinians? Can they be negotiated with in some way, shape, or form? Before you answer, I want to share the perspective of one of the most prominent spokespeople on this issue, Sheldon Richman. So Sheldon says, we, being the Jewish people or Israelis, it's an excuse we can't talk to the Palestinians because of Hamas. But Israel encouraged the development of Hamas because it was a religious rival to the secular PLO, who weren't fundamentalist Muslims or crazy jihadis. They did engage in outrageous suicide attacks that need to be condemned and stuff like that, but then they gave that up. Arafat accepted 22% of the land famously in 1988. He says, I'm not going to claim Arafat as a hero. He initiated violence, but it's not as bad as people think. We can sort it out. If people there have the right spirit, and the Israelis need to acknowledge the grievance of the Palestinians, well, in a way, they didn't start this. What do you say?
Well, just a few facts. Arafat was the largest killer of Jews after Adolf Hitler, after World War II. That's fact number one. So, to say that he wasn't that bad, I don't know. Second thing, it's very common these days to say, but there's one characteristic of anti-Zionism that basically blames Israel for every evil in the world, but particularly on every evil related to the situation in Israel. So if you have a monster like Hamas, who are you going to blame? Obviously Israel, because Israel is the source of all evil. Now, in this context, they say Israel created Hamas. Well, this is false. Hamas created itself as a part of followers of the Muslim Brotherhood in the 80s. What happened? Israel didn't focus on Hamas because at that time, the main driver for attacks and terrorism from the Palestinian Arabs was the PLO. Now, as the PLO was legitimated by Israel after the Oslo Accords in 93, Hamas became one of the main sources of terror from the Palestinian Arabs, together with other groups, for example, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. But it's not that Israel created Hamas. Israel didn't focus on stopping Hamas when it was created, which is a bit different. But then you go to the time when Hamas got in control of the Gaza Strip, in 2007 particularly, specifically after they kicked out the Palestinian Authority. Well, they launched a series of attacks over and over again throughout the years against Israel, rockets. And Israel launched defensive operations to stop the attacks and actually inaugurated the Iron Dome in order to stop the rockets incoming from the Gaza Strip. And so they tried to do everything they could in order to avoid the type of confrontation that they are having right now. Because the anti-Zionists will say, well, but Israel allowed, for example, Qatar, to finance Hamas in the Gaza Strip. Well, that happened because if you're going to accept that Hamas will exist in the Gaza Strip, you need to accept that they will get funding. But if you don't accept it, you need to destroy them. So the anti-Zionists cannot have it both ways. If you are going to be against Israel accepting the existence of Hamas or tolerating Hamas, then you must support Israel destroying Hamas as it is currently doing. But they don't want to accept that. They say right now, Israel is launching a genocidal war against Hamas in the Gaza Strip, against the Palestinian people in the Gaza Strip. Well, but what do you want? If Israel accepts that Hamas exists in Gaza and launches operations, defensive operations every 2-3 years in order to stop rocket attacks, in order to avoid getting in the Gaza Strip to destroy Hamas, you're against it. Because you say, well, Israel is funding Hamas. But then, when Israel is going to destroy Hamas, you say, what are they doing? They are destroying Hamas in the Gaza Strip. I mean, what do you want? Everything comes from the same basic idea, which is that Israel is the source of all evil. So if you're going to find an evil there, you will not say, how is it that the Palestinian Arab society is able to create these monsters? How is it the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Hamas, etc.? No, you don't say that. Because you don't want to blame Palestinian Arabs. You don't want to put responsibility on Palestinian Arabs. You want to say that Israel is, it has the fault for everything. And that's it. It's the most comfortable position to be in.
I'd like to say that I almost oppose the Iron Dome. I almost oppose it because if there were no Iron Dome, they would have had to gone in way before. And they should have gone in way before and ended it. But now let's take a hypothetical. Let's suppose that what you say is true. Let's suppose that Israel supported the creation of Hamas, that Israel was Hamas's mother and father, and that the reason that Israel supported Hamas was because PLO at the time was the main enemy, and Israel was hoping that Hamas would do better. Let's suppose that's true. I agree with Alan that it's not true, but hypothetically, let's suppose it's true. So what? So Israel made a mistake. So Hamas now is worse than the PLO right now. Okay, so Israel made a mistake. No big deal. It's not Israel's fault. They're human beings. Human beings are mistake-making animals, and Israelis are human beings, and therefore they make mistakes. So what? So they supported the wrong candidate at one time in the past. So what? So bloody what, as the British might say. Right now, Hamas is a very bitter enemy. Look at October 7th, and they have to be stopped. And now, suppose Israel supports the XYZ organization of the Arabs. And the XYZ is fine. And Hamas is very bad. But in 20 years, XYZ will be very bad. Well, then you get rid of the XYZ people, whoever they are. hypothetically. So I don't think that this is a powerful indictment of Israel, because even if it were true, which it's not, it doesn't really undermine the case for Israel.
What do we learn from all the different attempts at peace agreements and negotiations throughout the Israelis, or even preceding the official state of Israel, the Jews' attempts to spur peace with their neighbors?
What I think that Israel should fight back with two hands and not worry too much about what the UN says, and not worry too much about the public opinion in Europe, and not worry too much about what Biden or any of the Americans have to say. Israel should fight back more harshly. Now, my claim against Israel is that they were too pacifistic. They tolerated too much. They were too nice. Israel should be a little tougher, no, a lot tougher, and then a lot of these problems would go away.
There is a chapter in our book that's called Peace Treaties does not equal peace, something like that. And basically that's it. It's, you can sign whatever you want on a piece of paper, but peace is, it's fundamentally, it's a fact. It either exists or not. And as Israel signed many treaties with different entities, among these Egypt, Jordan, the UAE, and it was, we assume, about to sign something similar with Saudi Arabia before October 7th. Other treaties, peace treaties, actually were war treaties, because they, for example, the Oslo Accords and all subsequent treaties, the only thing that they achieved was to legitimize the Palestinian Arab side, in this case the PLO in their new form, the Palestinian National Authority, and the only thing that was achieved was to give them legitimacy in order for them to continue or to protect or to defend those that were attacking Israel. So peace treaties are not the same as peace, definitely.
A lot of people are taking their cues from the intellectuals. They shape the current of ideas. Some of the most prominent intellectuals, Noam Chomsky, Alexander Cockburn, Norman Finkelstein, the three of them came together 40 years ago on the heels of a book, an explosive book that came out on this topic by Joan Peters, From Time Immemorial. And it said it's a myth. It is a myth that the Palestinians have been there from time immemorial. Now, you seem to put less credibility, less stock into their argument. Why are the intellectuals mistaken?
Well, particularly on this case, it is a fact that there was no such thing as a Palestinian people that was existing from millennia in the area. This is a simple fact. Immanuel Kant talked about Palestinians in the 18th century, and he was referring to the Jews. Just one example, but we could go over and, we could continue for hours. But the most important thing about the challenge to the book that you mentioned is that the idea was that many of the Arabs that lived in the land of Palestine in the 20s, 30s, 40s immigrated to the area as a result of Jewish Zionist investments and civilization, basically, in the area. Now, this is a fact. What they object is the extent of the Zionist influence and the extent to which Zionist influence affected the population growth of the Arabs. But you have other sources that support the same facts. Now, why are intellectuals against Israel? Because of the fundamental myth that we were discussing at the beginning, which is that they believe that Israel is uniquely pernicious, as Rothbard said, because it was built on massive expropriation and expulsion from the land. That we saw it's not true. And even if something, let's say, expulsion and expropriation happened, which was for the most part not the case, expropriation for sure, and expulsion. Why? For a very specific and small part, it did take place during the War of Independence because of the war that was launched against Israel. So I think that most intellectuals see the subject with those glasses on those two myths, but there are other things that we could add to it. One is the idea that Israel is a colonial project, right? And then you have these people that try to, well, particularly in the modern world, in academia, to divide the entire world between the oppressed and the oppressor. And so they put Israel in the place of the oppressor and the Palestinian Arabs in the place of the oppressed. And they try to romanticize, in a sense, the struggle of Palestinian Arabs and to use Israel as an example of imperialist and the colonialist and the non-indigenous and you name it. But basically, it's a form or a specific instance of a more general rejection of the West, of capitalism, of success, particularly successful industrial civilization, which Israel clearly represents, especially on the technological side of that civilization. We could go on and on, but I think that those two, the fundamental myths, and the idea of placing Israel as the villain, the oppressor, the strong, because Israel is strong, therefore it's mistaken. It must be mistaken because it's immoral to be strong, to be successful. And so I think that there's a lot that could be said about that. Walter?
Yeah, I wanted to say that there is an entire literature, not so much or not at all that I'm aware of, as to why the intellectuals oppose Israel. But there is a very big literature on why the intellectuals oppose capitalism. And two of the most prominent contributors to this literature are Milton Friedman and Robert Nozick, both Jewish, by the way, and both exalted intellectuals, if I could use such a word.
People simply don't know the facts. And there are many, many things that we mentioned in the book that look silly, but they are very, very important. For example, Palestinian Arabs are often called just Palestinians. And there were Palestinian Jews. But if you ask to whom does Palestine belong, the reasonable thing would be to say it belongs to Palestinians. Otherwise, what would they be called? Palestinians, right? Well, but before the state of Israel was born, Jews were called Palestinians as well. And mostly were called Palestinian as well. I mean, mostly Jews. But then they were Israelis because Israel was born. So the term Palestinian went to the Arabs directly. We say that this very silly detail is very important in order to explain at least the initial approach to the subject. Because when a person is watching TV and is watching CNN or BBC, you name it, and they see that Israelis are launching attacks against, let's say, Hamas in the Gaza Strip, and Palestinian Arabs are killed, and then people don't know anything. They just see dead people, and they see that the area is called Palestine, or is being called Palestine, and the Palestinians are being attacked. Then you say, what are the Jews doing there? I mean, it sounds reasonable, right? At least on the face of it. At the same time, they say, well, the Jews are the white colonialists, Europeans. I can assure anyone that if they go to Israel, just watch Israeli people, Jews, you would see that they look similar to the Arabs. Because remember, 1 million Arabs were expelled from Arab countries. Many of them are now Israeli citizens. And they are not from European descent. They are from, Mizrahi, Sephardi descent. And they are from Arab countries. So this idea that the Jews are white and you name it, the entire thing is to project a specific kind of conceptual structure to the case of Israel. It's not the other way around. It's that they use, when I say they, I mean this type of academics that you refer to, or the students at elite institutions. They use the conceptual framework that they have, and they try to adapt the reality of the area to what they already know. So it's unfalsifiable. We actually wrote articles with Walsh about this. That type of mindset, it's impossible to refute because it doesn't go from evidence to theory and then back and forth. It goes from theory to whatever you can use in order to justify it. So it's unfalsifiable. And you say, well, colonizers, Israel is to blame. Just one more example, Josh. When the Al-Ahli hospital was bombed a few months ago in Gaza, everyone said, without any evidence, the health ministry in Gaza says that there are 500 people killed because of the rocket, the missile that was launched by Israel. They didn't have any evidence, but only by saying it, that was the entire evidence that was required, because people already knew, they thought they knew, that if it wasn't Israel, who is going to do such an atrocious thing? And once the evidence got into the picture, that it was the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, they ignored the subject. The subject was ignored because Israel was not involved.
Another example is recently there was a bombing of some civilians in Iran. And the first thing was, it must be Israel. And it turned out it was ISIS. But this is illogic, that Israel is wrong, and whatever the evidence is, it shows that Israel is wrong. So if this occurs with the hospital, it's Israel's fault in Iran. Now, I'm not against Israel bombing either nuclear or military things in Iran. But civilians, Israel does not bomb civilians. ISIS does, not Israel.
If distinctions don't matter, anything can be true. It's like we're living in 1984, Orwell's wonderful dystopian fiction, and it's become reality. He says war is peace. You guys said the peace process isn't a peace process. It's a war process. Suicide bombers, they're called freedom fighters, and they're given roads, and they're given holidays named after them, and they're paid salaries to do what they do. Help us draw a distinction. Is the IDF, who is also celebrated for killing those whom it opposes, is it different from these freedom fighters?
I would say IDF and the freedom fighters are polar opposites. IDF is defensive. Those people are offensive. Those people are purposefully attacking civilians, mothers, rapists. You know, they talk about Israel is disproportionate in its response to October 7th. Israel should be proportionate. Does that mean the IDF should go into Gaza and start raping women? But the IDF doesn't rape women. The IDF doesn't kill babies purposefully. Yes, there's collateral damage. Look, if you put a rocket launcher in the middle of a hospital or in the middle of a school and you want to take out that rocket launcher, well, then there are going to be innocent people dying. But whose fault is it? It's not the IDF's fault. It's the perpetrators.
The entire approach of the IDF is to defend Israelis and, the citizens from attacks. That's why it's called the Israel Defense Forces. Now, you may say it's called like that, and it attacks in the same way that all socialist countries are called republics and democracies. I mean, you could say that, but again, look at the evidence. If the IDF would want to wipe out the Gaza Strip, kill everyone, they would last one day. This is simply a fact known by everyone. What else can you do? What else can you say when the IDF is being labeled as a genocidal machine or that they are attacking indiscriminately in the Gaza Strip? It's not the case. If it were the case, you would find out very quickly.
If Hamas surrendered and gave up all its hostages, 5 minutes later, there'd be no more IDF killing of anyone.
So the U.S. has supported Israel. And it seems like its support is more conditional, that waxes and wanes. But it's said that it's given unconditional support to Israel over about the last 75 years. Do you think that has helped Israel's peace effort, or has it hurt that effort?
Well, it's done both. On the one hand, thanks to the U.S. help, the Israeli gave up the Sinai Peninsula, which was not much help.
And got the Iron Dome, which you suggest may net out as a net detriment. If you had to say net plus or net detriment, where do you put it?
I'm not sure. It's a ticklish question. That's a rough one. I sometimes wish that there were no Iron Dome, because then Israel would have to go in and stop them. Instead, the Iron Dome is what the Israelis call lawn mowing. It's a temporary palliative. It's not a radical eradication of the problem. It's putting a Band-Aid on the cancer patient. You don't want to put a Band-Aid on the cancer patient. You want to get in there and do chemotherapy or whatever the latest technique is. And the Iron Dome is a Band-Aid. Like most things in reality, it's complicated on the one hand. And now we're not talking about private Jewish contributions to Israel. We're talking about government aid. Yes, by the way, the libertarian view is the U.S. should not be donating, and government should not be donating 1 penny to Israel. And they talk about, well, there are billions. I forget how many billions every year, 4 billion, 5 billion. But if you add up the foreign aid, and we shouldn't really call it foreign aid, we should call it government-to-government transfers, because sometimes it's not really aid. But the government-to-government transfers from the U.S. to Israel is dwarfed by the government-to-government transfers to all the Arab countries put together. Yes, Israel gets more foreign aid from the U.S. than any other one country. But forget about one country. Add up all the Arab countries together and how much foreign aid do they get? They get way more than Israel. I think it's twice or 3 times as much. So yes, Israel has been helped by the U.S. government, and it's been hurt by the U.S. government. And as to whether one outweighs the other, I really can't say.
You have arguments on both sides, but what I can say is that for libertarians, for example, you could say, well, the foreign aid is out of the question, right? It's like unanimous that there should be none. But what about moral support? For example, at the UN, for once, I'm in favor of the US, for example, using its veto power at the UN Security Council in order to defend Israel. Because if you are a civilized country and you have another civilized country and you can help it by voting, I think that that's the right thing to do. And that is what any libertarian should support, because you're supporting the country that respects individual rights, that respects property rights, that respects to a large extent free markets and capitalism. And so what are you going to do? You're going to abstain. You're going to say, no, it's not my problem. Well, it doesn't involve sending money. It involves moral support. And that, I think, that's correct. I think that is legitimate.
But there's something you get into called the hudabiyah, which seems to undermine the integrity of contracts. Can you explain why this is such a vital principle?
Well, you are referring here to when you make a peace treaty. If you are allowed to trust, well, you know what, Arafat actually, after signing the Oslo Accords, said that don't worry, this is just one step from the phase plan. That there are several phases in order to, until you get to destroy Israel. First you delegitimize it, you demonize it, and then you keep fighting, and then until you destroy it. Well, that is, I think that there is some to that. But the most important thing is, if your enemy understands that it cannot destroy you, then any treaty that you would get with your enemy must be based on real goodwill, understanding, and not necessarily love, because no love will ever arise from a situation where you had to kill it, you had to kill each other, but respect. That's the basic premise. Israel does not make peace with its neighbors, Jordan, Egypt, the UAE, Bahrain, you name it, because they fall in love. No, it's because they respect each other. They say, I accept that you exist, you accept that I exist, and if we have to fight, I will fight to the end. And so, with that in mind, I don't think that deceit would be necessarily expected in a peace treaty or a deal that's made under these premises.
The Arab countries that now have a contract or a treaty with Israel might fear Iran more than Israel.
Right.
And that is another part of the story here, that Israel is very peaceful. Iran, through its proxies, is not as peaceful as Israel is. Yes, Israel is not peaceful in one sense. Was it the 1972 Olympics where the Israeli team was killed?
Right.
Those people that perpetrated that, wherever they were, Israel went and got them. And I'm pretty sure that there are Hamas leaders now in Qatar that should fear for their lives with justification, because Israel will get them. But that's very different than what Iran is doing. Iran is doing very different things in Syria and in Iraq and these other countries. So I think that the situation is very grim. And as Alan says, a big part of the reason for those countries to respect their treaties is the power of Israel. And I think we're very powerful Israel.
Why were the Oslo Accords and other peace treaties doomed from the start?
Well, the Oslo Accords were an attempt to end the so-called Arab-Israeli conflict. Basically, that was it. Now, it consisted mainly in the recognition in 1993, after a few years of negotiations with the PLO, it consisted in recognizing the PLO, that is the Palestinian Liberation Organization, as the legitimate representative of the Palestinian people, Palestinian Arabs. And in that respect, it was the idea that if the PLO was recognized as a legitimate voice for Palestinian Arabs, then they would have the ability to begin to build their own state in the areas where most Palestinian Arabs lived, in the Gaza Strip and in Judea and Samaria, that is Ramallah, Qalqilia, Bethlehem, I mean, you name it. So basically that was the idea. In other words, why it was going to fail? That is because what Israel did by accepting the idea of the Oslo Accords was to give back life to the PLO that was slowly dying. There are several reasons why that was the case, but just to name a few, the PLO, Arafat, supported Saddam Hussein when the dictator invaded Kuwait. And after they lost the war, when the US intervened and basically avoided Kuwait to be conquered by Iraq, then the people in Kuwait, basically those in charge, said, well, the PLO was in favor of our enemies. And then what happened was that there was a huge expulsion and expropriation of Palestinian Arabs and Arabs of Palestinian Arab descent from those countries. We're talking about tens of thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people, actually, and billions of dollars in assets. So that severely affected the finances of the PLO, but also their reputation in the Arab world. That's one. The second is that they lost one of their main supporters, which was both politically, financially, and militarily, which was the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union fell apart at the beginning of the 90s. So that's two. And three, because it was losing support among Palestinian Arabs in the Palestinian Arab territories at the time. And there was a very, slowly growing middle class there that perhaps could have been a different voice in order to reach a peace agreement. So among other reasons, those I think are some of the most important. And instead of Israel identifying the PLO as dying and therefore waiting for it to definitely disappear in order to negotiate with a voice that was willing to engage in actual peace talks, it decided that since the PLO was disappearing, then they will have to negotiate in order to stay alive, and they will have to change their policy of wanting to destroy the state of Israel. So they understood the situation backwards, if you want, in a sense. And so what actually happened was that Arafat, after signing each successive peace deal, said one thing in English and another different thing in Arabic. And just to make a summary of what happened after the PLO became the Palestinian National Authority through the Oslo Accords, we can say that it was understood as the phase plan, which was actually a plan devised a few decades before in order to identify steps or phases to destroy Israel. And one of those steps was to accept whatever Israel was willing to give in order to slowly gain political control over specific areas and to, keep attacking Israel from those and slowly delegitimizing Israel, demonizing Israel in the international arena. So that was the idea. They said so explicitly, basically, and that's what they did. Which is why in 2000, when Barak was the prime minister at the time of Israel, offered Arafat everything that they would be that they could expect. That is Judea and Samaria, a swap of lands inside of Israel, the Gaza Strip, half of Jerusalem, sharing, specific parts, the Temple Mount, the Old City. I mean, you name it, and among other stuff. And they said no because, of course, the entire idea was to say no from the beginning. This was, like a collective delusion on the part of Israeli politicians, on the left primarily, and a large part of the Israeli public, because they thought that the end of history, that was the spirit of the time. Capitalism, free markets, peace, the Soviet Union fell, and that's it. So the idea was, okay, so this has to stop, this conflict, so-called conflict. It didn't, and it brought about 1,000 Israelis killed, murdered in terrorist attacks, especially after the peace process fell apart in 2000, and a few months later, the second Intifada was launched.
I would say Arab intransigence. I would say Jew hatred. And I would say misunderstanding on the part of left-wing Israelis as to whether they had a partner for peace. They thought they did, they didn't. So that would be a very brief addition. If they wanted peace with Israel, Israel would be more than happy to make them the Hong Kong of the Middle East, to help employ them, to educate them, let them be in the hospitals, let them be in the universities, whatever. But the Arabs, the Palestinians, don't really want peace. What they have is hatred for Jews, and that's why it doesn't work.
You mentioned that the Arab-Israeli conflict, a term we obviously hear a lot, is actually a misnomer. Why?
Wherever you find a specific conflict, first you have to identify what is it that the conflict is about. And there are two sides to the conflict, and presumably they could reach an agreement if they want to solve the conflict. But the problem is that if we identify the nature and the cause of the so-called Arab-Israeli conflict, is that one side, the Arab side, does not want the other side to exist. So basically, there is no solution to the conflict as such. There is only one possible, conclusion to the conflict, which is an Israeli victory, which is, in other words, peace. That is, that the other side understands that it won't be able to destroy Israel. That's what an Israeli victory means. It doesn't mean to crush and to turn into rubble the other side. No, it means that the other side should understand that Israel has a right to exist, that Jews have a right to live and thrive, and that's it. And then they could trade and they could, thrive together through free markets and commerce and voluntary association, just like any other society has done. So that's why it is mistaken to understand this as a conflict, and that is why it cannot be solved, and that is why any solution that has been provided or proposed has failed, because this is not a conflict. This is a genocidal intent to destroy one side. Now, some countries, Arab countries, have understood this. For example, Egypt, and more recently others, let's say the United Arab Emirates, and those that signed the Abraham Accords. Now, they understood that Israel cannot be destroyed. By recognizing that Israel cannot be destroyed militarily, they had to arrive to the only possible conclusion, which is, okay, so if we cannot win the war, we have to stop making war. And that's why commerce and trade and new, joint ventures are thriving between those countries. Even Saudi Arabia was about to do that before October 7th. So the only side that still believe that is able to destroy Israel is Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iran, basically, which is the puppet master behind all of this.
There was a cartoon that somebody sent me, a beautiful cartoon. There were four people. There was a Hamas person, and he had a little baby right here, holding the baby right here. And then there was a guy from the UN, and then there was Netanyahu. And the depiction was, what does Hamas want? And the answer was death to all Jews. And it's important that they have a baby there, because what they do is they hide behind their own babies. They put missile launchers in hospitals and in schools, and then they blame the Israelis for bombing those places to get at the missile launchers because you're killing innocent people. They're hostages. Yes, they're Israeli hostages, but the Gazans are hostages to Hamas. And you know what the UN guy is saying? Can't you meet these people halfway? Now remember, what the Hamas is saying is kill all Jews. So if you meet them halfway, then it's okay to kill half the Jews? This is just preposterous. I think Ellen is correct that there's Iran, there's Hezbollah, and there's Hamas. And their view is kill all Jews, and it's really hard to compromise with that. What do? Kill half the Jews, maybe a quarter of the Jews? Whereas the Abraham Accord people have finally achieved some sort of cognition of reality. They know that Israel is there to stay. They know that Israel is too powerful to conquer. They've lost many a war. And the ones that they didn't lose, Israel was fighting with 1 3/4 hands behind their back because of fear of alienating people in Europe or the United States. Look, right now, Biden wants a ceasefire. He wants a ceasefire even though Hamas has promised another October 7th. What kind of ceasefire do you make with your enemy when your enemy still wants to kill you? This is just preposterous. The only way to solve the problem, the only way to attain peace is to get rid of Hamas. And as long as Hamas, or to get them to change their view, if they said, okay, look, no more October 7th, or something like that. And if we could believe them, and if they let all their kidnapped victims, their hostages go. But none of that is happening. And yet Biden is saying, well, we have that Netanyahu is intransigent. Netanyahu is not intransigent. Netanyahu is sensible. He is trying to get rid of an enemy that is avowed to death to all Jews. I mean, that's hard to see how you can compromise a situation like that.
Subcuse Israel from the start of being the result of U.S. imperialism in the Middle East. Is it?
Well, let me start in on that one. I don't think so. I think that's preposterous again. That you see, there are really two issues going on here that are problematic. One is the hatred of Jews on the part of Arabs. I think that's the main one. But then there's this other issue about land titles. The excuse that they use is, well, it's imperialism, it's colonialism, the idea that the Jews are taking over property that isn't their own, they're stealing land. And here we make, I think, a great contribution in our book, trying to clarify just who owns what. And there are two sections or two stages. One is 2,000 years ago. And yes, it's hard to prove anything to 2,000 years ago, but the issue is not can you prove anything 2,000 years ago, it's rather who has a better claim to what's going on 2,000 years ago, the Jews or the Arabs. See, like, suppose we were baseball analysts, and I said Team A is going to beat Team B because Team A, their batting average is 100. 100 is very low. And I left it at that. The obvious response is, well, what's the batting average of the other team? And if you just look at one team, you say, well, the Israeli claim from 2,000 years ago is imperfect. Therefore, Israel is wrong. No, you want to know what the claim of the other guys is. And nobody talks about the claim of the Arabs from 2,000 years ago. And that claim is very bad, very poor. The Israeli claim is better. And it's the same thing in the more modern period of 100 or 150 years ago. They say, well, the only, 7%, the only legitimate land title of the Jews is 7%, which leaves the idea that the Arabs had 93% of the land. But most of the land of the Arabs was a swamp or desert. And the idea here is we're sort of fans of John Locke. And the idea is he who owns land is he who makes labor with the land. And if your main claim for land is a swamp where nobody ever could cultivate, or a desert which couldn't be cultivated, uncultivatable and uncultivated, well, then how does that justify any land title? So let me give you one more analogy. In one of my books, what we did is we rated the economic freedom of all the countries in the world. We broke it down into monetary theory, regulation, trade, and other things like that. Now, under monetarism, what we really wanted was the gold standard, or whatever the free market money was. And it's usually the gold standard, whenever people were free to choose. But suppose we put in that criteria. Well, the problem with that is there's no one on the gold standard. And if you want to rate the economic freedom of different countries, you have to get something where they diverge. And if they all if none of them have the gold standard, then they all get a 0. So how does that help to diverge or differentiate them? It doesn't help at all. Well, it's the same thing here. What you want is a way of differentiating. It's not a matter of, is the Israeli land claim perfect? No, it's not perfect. The question is it better than the other guys? And that's something that is just lost in people don't talk about that.
Our argument that is sometimes used as a straw man, or that we are basing our entire case for Israel on that argument, is often mentioned, that we say that there is a specific group of Jews, which are the Kohanim, that have the right to a specific piece of property, which is the Temple Mount. Why? Because we know that a case could be made that modern day Kohanim could be actually descend. So that's the case that could be made, that they descend from the same people that built the property, the Temple Mount. We have several different points in order to make a case for that hypothesis. Now, why do we do that? We do that because the Temple Mount is so important in this so-called conflict that the other side, that is the Palestinian Arab side, and the Arab world in general, often say that there was no temple there. They call it Al-Aqsa, Al-Haram al-Sharif, they call it. Now, this is important. Even the operation, the genocidal operation by Hamas a few months ago was called the flood of Al-Aqsa. We know that, right? Now, why do they do that? They do that because they want to erase any connection between the Jewish people and the land of Israel. That is why they do that. And that is why they also say that, for example, Jesus was a Palestinian. Things that don't make any sense. Now, but why is it that they do that? They do it because they know that without creating or pointing to a connection between a specific people to a land, there can be no national case to be made, right? It cannot be done, or it would be incomplete. Now, in this respect, someone could say, well, but you're trying to to allocate property rights according to a tribal or collectivistic view. Okay, but what is the alternative? That the entire property be administered and controlled by the Islamic Waqf? Why? Or Jordan or Saudi Arabia? Why? There was a Jewish temple there that was there, and then when the Arabs came and conquered the land, they actually built the mosque and everything that's on top of it now. So, I mean, you could try to erase history, but history is there, and in this case, you have evidence from the era of the Temple Mount that is being discarded by the Islamic authorities in that place. I mean, you could see pieces of the clothes of the priests there, of the Jewish priests of the time. I mean, we mention all sorts of evidence in the first chapter of our book. Now, could this same principle be applied if there are better ways to identify property rights? Of course not. I mean, it's not the optimum. It's not the best way to identify property rights, and we use it only in specific cases, just such as this one. Most of our case for Israel, or the Jewish right to homestead land in the area where their forefathers came, is that they came back to an area that was mostly unpopulated, mostly deserted, and it was basically an underdeveloped land where there was almost nothing there built, no industry, no significant agricultural development. So that's the case for Israel. I mean, when people say, no, you're making a genetic and, no, that's not what we are doing. We're trying to use libertarian philosophy and classical liberal philosophy in order to identify an innovative way to solve or try to identify which side is correct on very specific and complex, places such as the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, because they are very important to the entire problem here, not because we're trying to make up some theory. Now, on the rest of the land, which is most of the land, we use what any other libertarian would use, which is Lockean principles, such as Walter said. I just wanted to make that distinction clear.
Before Israel declared statehood in 1948, on through to today, there's been the notion that Palestinian people are just hostages to some Arab ideologues and leaders. And it's just those leaders who want to remove the Jewish people. Is that the case?
They did have an election in 2005, I think it was, and Hamas won. Hamas won overwhelmingly. So it's not just the leaders. And even now, there have been surveys of the Gazans. How many of you support October 7th? And the majority support October 7th. So
Yes, I'm no big fan of Arab leaders, but Arab leaders aren't the only ones. It's also the man in the street. I mean, when 9/11 occurred and the World Trade Center was knocked out by those airplanes, and you looked at the reaction of Gazans, average Gazans in the street, they were giving candy to babies. They were applauding. They were dancing on the top of cars. This is hard to say that it's only the leaders and that they're all innocent. Now, I'm sure there are some, there must be 1 or 2 or 3% that looked askance at this and maybe were squelched because they would have been brutalized if the others found out that they weren't really on board. But I can't believe that. Now, another thing that occurred in 1948 was that and here the Arab leaders were really responsible. What happened was right before the 5 armies came into Israel in 1948, a message came from the Arab leaders: go away, get out, because if you're there, it's going to be hard for us to kill the Jews. Whereas if you're not there, we can kill the Jews much more easily, pile them up like timberwood or whatever, and then in a week or two, when we win the war, then you can come back. So here, the Arab leaders were certainly problematic. But the people who followed, and now they're saying, well, they were just taking a vacation. Look, if I drive you 2 guys to a bank and then I pick you up because you made a deposit or you made a withdrawal, that's fine. But if you rob the bank, I'm not that innocent anymore. And yet I did the same exact thing. And namely, in both cases, I drove you there and I picked you up after you were finished with your business in the bank. Well, yes, these people, you could say, well, they took a vacation. But that's one way to look at it. Another way to look at it is they were aiding and abetting the 5 Arab armies in 1948 when Israel was just starting. And they're not quite as innocent as you might want to think.
This is not hypothetical, because when the war ended, specific places like Judea and Samaria were in control by Jordan. And there were Jewish communities before the war that were ethnically cleansed and their properties were stolen from them. No one cares. No one even mentions that. So, I mean, we could extrapolate from that very specific example, from that very specific time, what could have happened to the rest of the Jews if Israel lost the war. I mean, they would have been murdered, expelled, ethnically cleansed, and expropriated, which is what happened to Arab Jews in Arab countries as well. No, the problem is the state of Israel. It's not the Jews. Okay, but where are Arab Jews? Where were Arab Jews after 1949 when the war ended? They were progressively ethnically cleansed and expropriated. So why is it that, I mean, libertarians and non-libertarians never talk about that? It's like the obsession is so clear. And those who are in favor of Israel, it's like we have to explain all the time. I mean, no. Sometimes the other side should explain what's the alternative. Please tell me, what do you think would have happened if Israel lost the war? Do you think the Jews would have been welcome in order to thrive and, dance and swim in rivers of chocolate with the Arabs? I mean, it's ridiculous. But no one is asking that question. No one is saying that. It's like, it's taken as a given. Israel should reply, should defend itself, in international organizations and in the media. And why? Because Israel won. Otherwise, we would be, still suffering and remembering all those Jews that were killed in 1948 when they tried to build their state once again. And, we would have the sympathy of the world. But, it's better not to have sympathy, but to live, actually, sometimes.
Mm-hmm. You ask a question. Do you have an answer or a theory about why the preponderance of positions are anti-Israel on this matter?
I'll start with that one, and the answer is again two words: Murray Rothbard. Murray Rothbard is a genius. Murray Rothbard is not the best economist of the last century. He's the best economist ever. Murray Rothbard is not the best legal theoretician of the last century. He's the best legal theoretician ever. I am a big fan of Murray Rothbard. I revere Murray Rothbard. I am grateful that I had a long, many decades friendship with Murray Rothbard. Do I agree with him on everything? No. There are 3 or 4 issues that I disagree with him. One of them is Israel. So you ask, why is it that so many libertarians are anti-Israel? You mentioned the Lou Rockwell report, LRC, LouRockwell.com, as being very much against Israel, more in favor of Hamas. I think you mentioned it before we started taping, and that's true. And I would say that the reason for it is that Murray wrote this book, not a book, an essay, something about war guilt in the Middle East, something like that.
Right.
And there he took a view that Alan and I think was mistaken. Now, look, just because you're a genius doesn't mean that everything you do is correct. And Alan and I, speaking just in favor of me, the reason I got into this book with Alan was mainly that article. And what Murray challenged us there, he said, look, you anarcho-capitalists, of which I am and Alan is, all you do is you say a pox on both your houses, all governments are evil, and you let it go at that. And Murray challenged us to go deeper. He said, look, it's all well and good to say all governments are evil. Yes, we've heard that. But some governments are more evil than others, Murray correctly said. And he challenged libertarians to determine which ones are more guilty, like in the Arab-Israeli confrontation, which one is worse, given that they're both bad. Yes, we're against the Israeli government because we're anarcho-capitalists. We're against every government. But to say that and leave it alone is insufficient. And our claim is that Murray erred here. He ignored stuff from 3,000 or 2,000 years ago, and he also erred in terms of property rights of 100, 150, 200 years ago. Again, he credited Arab ownership for uncultivated land, uncultivatable because it was swamp and it was desert. So we think he made a mistake. And you ask, well, then why is the libertarian movement moving in that direction? Because he is Mr. Libertarian. He is the leader of, him and Ron Paul, I would say, are the leaders of the libertarian movement, and Ron Paul and Murray are united on this. They're not united on abortion. Murray is pro-choice, Ron is pro-life, so they diverge on other issues. And, you know, the joke is you ask 10 libertarians a question, you get 11 answers. Libertarians diverge on many issues, abortion, immigration, voluntary slavery. There are whole bunches of issues where we disagree. But Murray is properly revered in the libertarian community, and Murray staked out in his essay, War Guilt in the Middle East, a certain position, and I think that's probably 95% of why so many libertarians oppose Israel in favor of Hamas.
Many libertarians, unfortunately, think that the only entity capable of evil in the world is the US government. And they think that other political entities have no agency or are what they are because of the US government. So they use it as an a priori principle or axiom. That is, the US government is the source of all evil in the world, and therefore whatever they see closest to the US government, that's evil as well, and whatever is against that which they identify as close to the US government must be good. And so they, it's like a Pavlovian reaction, basically. This is against the US. They have to be right, or maybe they have their reasons. So they kind of support and any dictatorship and totalitarian agenda or group or anything. They don't even look if it's libertarian or not, because most of these groups, Hamas, I cannot even think about other things more unlibertarian than Hamas. But, for some reason they support Hamas.
So Rothbard came out very clearly against targeting civilians. Even if you're fighting in self-defense. And he rejected the idea wholesale of collective punishment. Now, you mentioned the article in his, I think, trademark book, For a New Liberty. He gives the example of Smith attacking Jones. So I want to share with you a passage and get your reaction to this. He says, aggression only makes sense on the individual Smith-Jones level, as does the very term police action. These terms make no sense, though, on an interstate level. First, we've seen the government entering a war becomes the aggressor against innocent civilians. Indeed, governments doing this become mass murderers. The correct analogy to individual action would be Smith beats up Jones, the police rush in to help Jones, and in the course of trying to apprehend Smith, the police bomb a city block, murder thousands of people, or spray machine gun fire into an innocent crowd. This is a far more accurate analogy, for that is what a warring government does. And in the 20th century, and he wrote this 50 years ago, in the 20th century, it does so on a monumental scale. But any police agency that behaves this way itself becomes a criminal aggressor, often far more so than the original Smith who began the whole affair. Is he right?
I think he contradicts himself in several ways here. First of all, if I only knew that reading of Murray, I would say he was a pacifist. He's against war, against all war. But he wasn't against all war. He favored defensive wars. Nowadays the NBA is on and the National Basketball Association, and when the other team has the ball, everyone starts yelling, defense, defense. Namely, they can distinguish between defense and offense. Murray could do that, and he favored the U.S. colonies, 13 colonies, against British rule in 1776. He also favored the South in the War of 1861. I don't call it a civil war, because a civil war, both sides want to run the whole country, and the South didn't want to run the North. So he's not against war, as this passage might imply. And I think it does more than imply, because in every war there are innocents who are killed. And yet Murray favored defensive war. The second thing is, I return to that cartoon I mentioned. The Hamas guy had a baby right here, holding the baby. What's that all about? These people are, I don't know about, maybe not unique. I'm not a historian enough to say whether it's unique, but it's certainly unusual to hide behind babies. The point is that these Hamasians, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right or allowed to politically correct say that, the Hamas people, they put their rocket launchers in the middle of schools and hospitals. They hide behind their own people. And then Israel somehow gets to blame for this. Look, they promised more October 7th. What is Israel supposed to do? Are they supposed to say, oh, well, since you have innocent people there, I'm not sure how many, I'm willing to concede everyone under 5 years old, every Gazan under 5 years old is innocent, totally innocent. I not only conceded, but it's absolutely true. 5-year-olds can't be, or younger, can't be guilty of anything. So does that mean that Israel can't defend itself? That Israel can't bomb any rocket launchers? That right now, I think, what is it? Maybe 230 IDF soldiers have died fighting the war in Gaza, something like that. It keeps creeping up, and every time I look at it, it's another dozen IDF soldiers who've been killed. And every time I read that, I am very unhappy. The right number of IDF soldiers to have perished is 0. So what are they going to do? They are much more gentle than any other army. Look at what the U.S. Army did in Dresden. Look at what the U.S. Army did in Tokyo, Hiroshima, and Nagasaki. There were innocent people dying there too. And now Japan and Germany are friendly. What they're trying to say is, can't you meet them halfway? They want to remember the cartoon. I'm very impressed with this cartoon. Hamas is saying kill all Jews, and the UN is saying can't you meet them halfway? This is crazy to say that Israel can't defend itself because innocent people will die. It's collateral damage. It's not purposeful. What other army drops leaflets on people saying, well, we're going to bomb this, go away? What other army says, well, look, you're in North Gaza, go to South Gaza because we're going to kick butt in North Gaza? No other army does that. Israel is too gentle. Israel should be a little tougher. They shouldn't fight with practically two hands behind their back. They should kick some serious butt so that it stops. And if they, what do they say? Spare the rod and spoil the child. Spare the rod on Hamas and spoil Hamas. So I'm very much against this idea that Israel is engaged in genocide. If anyone is engaged in genocide, it's Hamas. How do you determine genocide? Genocide is, after the war is over, then what happens? As Ellen was saying, if Israel lost the war, what would have happened? Every Jew would have been slaughtered. Just like on October 7th. When Israel wins the war, do they start slaughtering? Do they start raping Arab women? The whole thing is preposterous. If anyone with an eye to see who is neutral on this would come out in favor of the Israeli side.
It is conceivable that Murray Rothbard didn't see every possible type of warfare in history or in the world. I mean, it was not all written by libertarians and analyzed by libertarians like Rothbard. So why should we look for the answer to any conceivable question in libertarian bibliography? It's the world is more, it's bigger than libertarian philosophy, and some things happen, and you need to use the libertarian glasses in order to try to see, okay, so what do we do here? How do we apply this philosophy here? So in this case, what Rothbard had in mind is the idea of a regular war, that is with regular armies. So in that case, it's obvious that if you're going to fight a war and you attack civilians, it's because it's deliberate. You have to go to the civilian population in the city where no military, targets are currently there, and you indiscriminately bomb everything. It's not the case in here, because here what happens is that you are fighting irregular armies, that is Hamas, which is actually operating within the civilian population and below the civilian population in tunnels. So it's a complete different situation. But let me ask you a question. Who is actually targeting deliberately civilians? It's Hamas. When they are launching tens of thousands of rockets, where are they launching the rockets? To civilian population in Israel, indiscriminately. And why is it that no more civilians in Israel are dying? It's because Israel has the Iron Dome. Now, it's being analyzed with the lens of, who is winning the war, or who has the most capabilities in order to win the war. Of course, it's gonna be the IDF, but that doesn't mean that the genocidal intent is not on the side of Hamas. That's the truth.
Walter, you mentioned that the left is guilty of harboring ideas that are just impossible and misguidedly anti-Israel. At least there's a heterodoxy of ideas. You've got a left, you've got a right. You see people who are protesting. They're up in arms about any issue. You've got hawks, you've got doves. Take your pick. Any issue in Israel, you're going to have people erupting in protests. When it comes to attacks against innocent civilians, in Israel, Jewish or otherwise, do we see peaceful protesters in the Arab world, or any protesters who are protesting these attacks against these innocent civilians?
No, anyone who protests in these countries gets shot. In Israel, they have all sorts of protests. One of the recent protests was over the Supreme Court of Israel. The idea was that it's undemocratic to mess around with the Supreme Court of Israel. This is highly problematic because the Supreme Court of Israel is self-perpetuating. When a member of the Supreme Court of Israel dies, guess who picks his or her replacement? The other Supreme Court judges. Whereas in the U.S., when you have a vacancy, someone dies or retires from the Supreme Court, the Congress, the president picks, and the Congress approves or doesn't approve. And the leftists in Israel were very much against Netanyahu and the Likud party, who was saying, well, let's use the U.S. system. They said it's undemocratic. The U.S. system is undemocratic. It's somehow democratic if you have a self-perpetuating Supreme Court. Part of the reason, I hesitate to say this, but I'm going to say it anyway, part of the reason for October 7th might well have been these massive protests on the part of Israeli left against Netanyahu and his view on the Supreme Court. Because look, if I were a Hamas leader and I noticed that Israel was having a big fight, that would be the time to attack Israel, right? But the point is that in Israel, you're allowed this. In Israel, they have women who wear miniskirts. They have homosexuals, not only homosexuals, but homosexual parades. Whereas in the Arab countries, if you're a homosexual, they take you up on a roof and they toss you off and they kill you. And the idea that there's feminism, if you don't wear the woman doesn't wear the proper thing. I think in Iran, she was actually killed over that. Israel is a civilized society. The Arab countries are not quite so civilized. So if you talk about is protest allowed, yes, protest is allowed in Israel, and I think Israel is a civilized society, and these others are less civilized.
There are objections all the time to settlements. What do you think about the settlements and the objections to them?
The truth is that Jews have a right to live anywhere that it's not already owned by another group or person, just as any human being has a right to live anywhere that's not been homesteaded before. So that's the only sensible answer that could be given to that question. Why? Because in Judea and Samaria, there are many places, most of it, which is not homesteaded. So why would Jews not be allowed to live there? I mean, 20% of Israel's population is Arab. So why wouldn't be possible for Judea and Samaria to have a Jewish population? It's impossible to explain. And why would the Palestinian Arabs oppose a Jewish population building in those areas? Can you imagine the opposite situation of what would happen if someone in Israel says, no, we don't want Arabs to build here, to homestead here, to live here? You would say, well, it's apartheid or genocide. I mean, ethnic cleansing, you name it. But when it comes to Jews in Judea and Samaria, it's like, it's different. Why? It doesn't make any sense.
I want to mention three words: cleansing, genocide, and apartheid. Ethnic cleansing occurred in Egypt and Iraq and Jordan and these other countries in 1948 when the Jews were kicked out. That was ethnic cleansing. Genocide is attacking innocent civilians. Hamas does that purposefully. Israel does not do that. Raping women, beheading children is genocide. Hamas is guilty of that, not Israel. And apartheid. this comes from South Africa, and we owe South Africa the latest thing before the International Court of Justice, that somehow Israel is guilty of all these things. Look, in Israel, there are Arab political parties. Not only there are Arab political parties, but they're in the Knesset. There are judges. There's a judge in the Supreme Court who is an Arab. Just one, but what the heck? And there are many other lesser judges who are Arab. There are Arab professors in Israel universities. There are Arab policemen. There are Arab members of the IDF. None of this occurred in apartheid South Africa. Under apartheid, there were no blacks in the Supreme Court of South Africa. There were no black professors. There were the idea that there was apartheid. Yes, there was apartheid in South Africa, but not in Israel. So, with regard to cleansing, genocide, and apartheid, I congratulate South Africa for bringing it to the International Court. But they just made one slight error. They accused Israel of this. They should have accused Hamas of that.
And why is the territory that's considered occupied territory not considered instead disputed territory?
Well, actually, it is disputed territory on legal grounds, because in order for it to be occupied, it would mean that there was another political entity that is being occupied. But Jordan, which was the only political entity that actually controlled Judea and Samaria before, otherwise known as the West Bank, cut their administrative ties with the area at the end of the 80s. So there is no political entity being occupied. I'm talking here specifically on legal terms. What is being said is that there is an occupation of a people. Well, in fact, most of the Palestinian Arabs in Judea and Samaria are under the political control of the Palestinian National Authority, not Israel. But Israel controls specific places in Judea and Samaria, and security and military areas and controls such as checkpoints and roads. Why they do that? That is pretty obvious, right? Because before there was a huge wave of attacks against Israelis, particularly on the Second Intifada. But the idea that there is an occupation, it depends on the understanding of the conflict, of the specific conflict in the area, I mean. Because is there military occupation of specific places? Yes. Is there a military occupation of the entire population? No. I mean, Palestinian Arab population. Is there an occupation in the legal sense of occupying another country? No, because there is no country there. So it's a complex situation, and it is disputed territories. Actually, that's the most correct definition.
Suppose Canada declared war on the United States, and don't tell me it can't happen. It happened on South Park, and if it happened on South Park, it could happen anywhere. So Canada gratuitously attacks the U.S., and now there's a war. And at the end of the war, the U.S. is occupying Manitoba, one of the provinces of Canada. Well, suppose the U.S. kept Manitoba. Well, it seems eminently reasonable that Canada started a war, and they lost Manitoba fair and square in this war, and it was an improper, aggressive war on the part of the Canadians, and they deserved to lose Manitoba. Well, now take the Golan Heights. The enemy started, the Golan Heights used to be a province of the Arabs, and a little hill right in the northeast of Israel, and they're shooting rockets down, and Israel finally had enough of that and conquered it. Well, now it's a controversial area. No, it's part of Israel. I wish that the Sinai Peninsula was still part of Israel. It was part of Israel, but Eisenhower, and I think after he retired, he said that was one of his biggest mistakes. Eisenhower compelled the Israelis to give the Sinai Peninsula back to Egypt. Well, Egypt lost this fair and square in the war. They were aggressive then, and Israel should have kept it. And it's the same thing with these Judea and Samaria, and now with Gaza. Gaza started that war. Israel should take it over.
Anti-Zionist. What is it, and what does it claim?
Okay, so anti-Zionism, it's the opposition to the idea that the Jews as a group have a right to build their own state, such as any of the other 200 countries on earth. And there is an anti-Zionism is particularly an obsession against one specific country. And you could identify anti-Zionism with several, points. First of all, it's this idea that everything that's evil in the world comes from Israel, and they basically use the same myths that were used by previous anti-Semitism, which is no longer politically correct. That is, Jews control the media, Jews control the banks, Jews control the governments. Now they say, no, it's the Zionists that control the media, the Zionists that control the financial system, the Zionists that control the US government, the Zionists that, you name it. In this respect, everything that comes from Israel should and must be identified as evil, which is why whenever something bad happens, it's because of Israel, obviously. For example, take when the Palestinian Islamic Jihad a few months ago bombed with one of the rockets a hospital in Gaza, Al-Ahli Hospital. And 5 minutes later, everyone, I mean literally everyone, international organizations, media, papers, you name it, they said, well, 500 people died. This was because of an Israeli strike. Nobody checked anything. Why? Because since the premise is that Israel is the source of all evil, then of course if something bad happens, who are you going to blame? Israel. And then, conversely, when it was shown that it was not Israel, but the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, then you don't say anything. Because why? If something bad happened and it was not to blame on Israel, better to look to the other side, and don't say anything. Because the other point is that Israel is always wrong, but Israel's enemies are always right. And if there is no way but to recognize that Israel's enemies did something wrong, then you have to blame it on Israel as well. For example, they say, well, Hamas, yes, well, but they are freedom fighters. But then you show that it's an Islamist totalitarian dictatorship, and that they raped and they killed and they burned people alive. Okay, oh yes, but Israel created Hamas, and Israel sustained Hamas. So it's basically the same argument over and over and over again. Everything should be blamed on Israel. Then you have another feature of anti-Zionism, which is the language they use. They use language with Israel that they use with no other country. They treat Israel of an apartheid state. They say it's a Nazi regime. They use the worst slanders you could think of for Israel. But they don't use those words for North Korea, for Iran, for Hamas in the Gaza Strip. So it's an obsession that could be analyzed from different perspectives. And then you have another feature of anti-Zionism, which is quite new, if you could say it's quite new, which is that it consists in using whatever is a burning issue and progressive, politically correct subject, and you use it in order to attack Israel. So you say, this intersectionality stuff. So you say feminism actually supports Palestinian liberation. Then you say climate change. Yes, of course, we should oppose Israel because of that. And then you could add, whatever you want in order to attack Israel. But basically, anti-Zionism is that. It's an obsession with the Jewish state, when anti-Semitism or Judeophobia was an obsession with the Jews.
Crystallize that a bit for me, because you call someone an anti-Semite, it doesn't make it so. You hear people called fascists everywhere all the time now. Doesn't make it so. What actually does it mean to be an anti-Semite? Or would you contend it's one and the same with being anti-Zionist?
Well, I think that you could find very, very small specific cases of people that are anti-Zionists but are not anti-Semites. You could find, many anti-Zionists love to quote Jews who are anti-Zionist. So they could say, well, look, if this Jew is against Israel, that means that that being against Israel doesn't make you an anti-Semite. Well, it depends on the argument. Because, for example, if you're, let's say, if you're an anarchist and you say, well, I oppose the state of Israel because I believe that anarchy is the ideal system. Well, that's one thing. But if you're going to be obsessively opposed to Israel and you're going to say, world peace will never be achieved if Israel still exists, then it's obvious that you are against Israel specifically because you are obsessed with it, because you have a problem with it. And now, why is that linked to anti-Semitism? Because it's the only Jewish state. It's the state where most Jews live, that speaks the Jewish language, that follows the Jewish calendar, where Jewish books are studied, where most Jews point their prayers to, where many Jews are linked in one way or another with family, friends, you name it. So, of course, if you have a problem with the state of Israel, it's obvious that you have a problem with the Jews. Now, many anti-Zionists don't want to recognize this fact, but it is a fact nonetheless, because if you ask them, why is it that you're so into this subject, into this particular, it's beyond any proportion what happens with respect to Israel. It's a very small country with a very small population. Palestinian Arabs are they are very low quantity as well, a small number of people, just like Israelis. And it's like you have so many conflicts throughout the world. But why is it that there is such an obsession with this conflict? And you know why? It's because Jews are involved. Because when Palestinian Arabs are expelled from Kuwait or Saudi Arabia, as I mentioned before, or they are murdered in Syria, no one cares. Or in Jordan, no one cares. So, you could use, one of John Stuart Mill's methods of induction in order to check, which is basically the difference in this specific case. And you could say, well, what's the difference? That no Jews are involved in those cases. So that's basically the answer.
Alan mentioned a whole bunch of mistreatments. I would add the Chinese are mistreating the Uyghurs. The Kurds are being mistreated in Turkey. The Igbos in Africa, the black tribes are slaughtering each other. And, the complaint is that Israel gets more foreign aid than any other country. And I think that's true, although Peter Bauer would admonish me for calling it foreign aid, because usually it's not beneficial. You call it government-to-government transfers. But yes, Israel gets the most, single country. However, if you add up all the Arab countries and what they get way more than Israel. So it's sort of an unfair comparison to compare country by country when it's really Israel versus, potentially 20, 25 Arab countries, all together of which get a lot more money from the U.S. than Israel.
We have a few groups. We have anti-Semites. We have anti-Zionists. There's another group, and they're called self-hating Jews. Is this a real phenomenon? Does it actually, some people chalk it up as silly. Does it really exist?
Absolutely, yes. Of course, you have self-hating Jews, and it's a very, it's a this phenomenon has existed throughout history. Uh, just to name a few, 100 years, a bit more, like 120 years ago, you had this philosopher, Otto Weininger, I think it was his name. He was an Austrian, and he influenced Ludwig Wittgenstein with respect to certain ideas he had, and he was a self-hating Jew, basically. Then you have Jews, like, for example, I believe his name was Arthur Trevich, Austrian Jew, that supported a very specific form of anti-Semitism, racial anti-Semitism. And I mean, you could name a lot of specific cases, right? And then, with respect to Israel, of course, you have self-hating Jews. You have self-hating Israelis as well. But, since Israel is a democracy, and in the sense that people can express their opinions, you have free speech in Israel, basically. They speak and they give their opinions. And one more thing, you will see that most of the narrative behind anti-Zionism is actually made by either Jews or Israelis. For example, Ilan Pappé, who is an Israeli historian, and basically the source for every myth against Israel, for example, expropriation and expulsion, ethnic cleansing. I mean, he's Israeli. And then you have, for example, Norman Finkelstein, that he's a Jew. And so, I mean, you could name, there are many cases. Noam Chomsky also. So, yeah, I don't see why this is particularly controversial. Otherwise, you would have to assume that Jews are a homogeneous bloc, but they are not. I mean, as we said many times, like you have two Jews, three ideas, such as if you have 10 libertarians, you have 11 ideas. So it's, it's no big deal just to recognize it as a fact.
I wanted to add two more possible self-hating Jews and reject both. One is Murray Rothbard. I don't think he's a self-hating Jew. I've known Murray for many years, and the big problem I had with Murray was stomach cramps. Why? Because he was so funny, and you'd be in a room with him, and you'd just be laughing after hour. So the idea of self-hating and Murray Rothbard don't fit. I think Murray is wrong on this issue, but I don't think he's a self-hating Jew. Another person that I come in contact with is Bernie Sanders. He and I were on the same high school track team together, so we were sort of buddies, actually. And he would be a good candidate for a self-hating Jew. However, the latest thing I got out of him was he was asked, should there be a ceasefire? Should there be made peace with the Hamas? And he was very good. He said, no, Hamas is dedicated to the destruction of Jews, and you can't deal with people like that. So he alienated a lot of his followers. So I have to compliment my old buddy Bernie. In some ways, he is a self-hating Jew, but lately he's exonerated that, and I take my hat off to Bernie Sanders for his very accurate assessment of Hamas.
We've addressed this in bits and pieces, but perhaps we could just sweep through the comprehensive solution. If you have anything that's more robust, but as the leader of Israel, if you were, how would you respond to the October 7th massacre?
I would respond the way Bibi Netanyahu responded. And by the way, I want to brag a little bit. We have a statement in our book from him supporting our book, and I'm very proud of that. And the quote I want to make from him is, if Hamas put down its arms, there would be peace. If Israel put down its arms, there'd be no more Israel. I think that really says it in a very succinct way, and it's a very important way. Israel wants peace. If these people would just stop the raping and the bombing and the beheading and all that other mishigas, there'd be peace. Gaza had a chance to be the Hong Kong of the Middle East. They're right next door to Israel, which is an intellectual powerhouse. If they would just stop this, they would be fine. But no. Their hatred for Jews overwhelms anything else. So I'm with Bibi Netanyahu. I understand now he's unpopular. He's losing out in political polls. But the main reason he's losing out is because he's not stopping until Hamas is ended. And I bless him for that.
I agree 100%.
And how about more broadly, looking at the Arab-Israeli conflict? Now I need to put that in air quotes. What's the solution to that?
Well, as I mentioned, it's Israel's victory. In other words, the understanding by the Arab side that still don't want to make peace with Israel, because a lot of Arab states have made peace with Israel, is the understanding that they cannot destroy Israel, and therefore the only possible path forward is to make peace. And in that respect, until the regime in Iran and Hezbollah and Hamas don't stop their aggression, that will not happen. But I think that we will get close to that soon.
Let's get to the maps. So in your book, you take us through the story of the Jews and the Arabs and Israel and the transitions with many different maps. Can you, however you're most able, take us through those transitions?
Yes, well, first you have our book is based on what happened mainly 2,000 years ago, but you could go way back. Actually, you could go to the time where Jews actually came to the land of Israel, Judea, and you could go to the kingdoms in Israel, David, Solomon, and successive kingdoms. Then you could go when Jews were attacked by the Assyrians, then the Babylonians that expelled them, and then they came back. Then you could go to the Maccabees, and finally the Romans when they took over the land and then expelled the Jews finally in 135 of the Common Era. So after that, several empires and different groups controlled the land. For example, the Arabs came in the 7th century. That was the time where they took over the Temple Mount and built the entire compound that still exists today. And then you had successive empires, and then you had the Crusaders, and then you had others, until you get to the the 15th, 16th century, when the Ottomans came, and they stayed in the land for about 500 years until World War I, when the British took over, until 1948, when the State of Israel was born. But in the meantime, you had several different groups that we mentioned, countries and empires and kingdoms and you name it. What you never had is a Palestinian Arab state, and I want to be very clear about that, because most people think that there was such a thing, and the Palestinian term, basically, it's a definition for an area that included what now is considered Jordan and the south of Syria. So it was not a specific political entity, Palestine, but it was a historical area, to put it more correctly. The size of Israel changed many times, because after the war in 49, Israel did not have control over Judea and Samaria or Gaza or the Golan Heights. That came after. First in 56, in 57, 6 after that war, yes, that Walter mentioned, Eisenhower forced Israel to give back the Sinai Peninsula. When Israel got back to control the Sinai Peninsula after 67, where it grew 3 times basically its size, Israel, because it got to control the Sinai, it got to control Gaza Strip from Egypt as well, and Judea and Samaria from Jordan, and the Golan Heights from Syria. So that was something that actually came to reduce its size later when it agreed to a peace deal with Egypt. It gave back the Sinai Peninsula at the end of the 70s. And then we could continue basically with that story until we get to the Oslo Accords that created 3 areas in Judea and Samaria, one of which is controlled by the Palestinian National Authority. And then in 2005, you had the Gaza Strip being given fully to the Palestinian National Authority. A year later, Hamas took over in elections. 2007, they expelled the Palestinian National Authority and took over the entire area. And we know what happened since then. And at the same time, in the north, you had a specific retreat of the IDF from southern Lebanon in 2000. That was also a change in the area and in the size of Israel. But basically, that was the summary of the story.
Another way to look at the map is there are certain maps that accentuate Arab ownership. And then there are other maps that we offer that offer a more accurate perspective on who owns what. And the way the critics of Israel look at it, virtually everything was properly owned by the Arabs. The way we look at it, it was very different. Namely, their claim to the land was, to a great degree, swamps and deserts, which is uncultivated and uncultivatable until the Jews made the desert bloom. That was very different. So there's a whole other set of maps, not as Alan depicted it, but in addition to the maps that Alan talks about, the maps that show an accurate assessment of Jewish and Arab ownership and an inaccurate set of maps.
Many people have challenged your views. Let's take a look at some of these challenges. Hans Hermann Hoppe, he says you're an unhinged collectivist, taken in by genocidal impulses. You justify the claim of present-day Jews to a homeland in Palestine based on their status as heirs of Jews having lived 2 millennia ago in the region, then called Judea. The claim of present-day Jews to a homeland in Palestine then can only be made if you abandon the notion of private property, private crime, and private guilt. And this Hamas attack on Israel was no more totally unprovoked than the Russian attack a little while ago on Ukraine. Alan, let's start with you. What say you?
Well, many points. Now, the first one is that we don't make a claim that present-day Jews have a right to every inch of the territory. I think that is quite clear. We use just that example that Hoppe brings, which is the Kohanim, because it's a very important example to show the core of the conflict, which is the rejection of any Jewish presence in the area whatsoever. Now, what do I mean by this? That there is a group that can be shown to descend from the original homesteaders and builders of one of the most important places in the entire dispute, if you will, which is the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. Now, it's a very little amount of terrain, if you will, but it's very significant because constantly the anti-Zionist propaganda, particularly on the Arab side, says that they get even to the point to say or claim that there was no such thing as a Jewish temple, and the entire place is called Al-Haram al-Sharif, and it's not the Temple Mount, and Jerusalem is called Al-Quds, and So what's the point of doing that? The point of doing that is to deny the connection between the Jewish people and the land of Israel, Judea. And so what we claim is that these people, this group of Jews, the Kohanim, exist today, and they have basically the same identity, the same national identity, with the same religious practices as the original homesteaders of the place. Plus, there is genetic evidence that they descend from those people. So the question is, who, on a comparative basis, who should be the owner of the Temple Mount? These Jews connected to the original builders, or the Islamic Waqf, which is the idea that it should be in Muslim hands? I mean, Hoppe never mentions the alternative. But if our position is collectivism, which we do not believe it is, what is Hoppe's position? Private property rights? Radical individualism? Absolutely not. He only presents our case as if it were absurd or try to mock us, but he never actually presents the case of who is the proper owner of that specific area. Now, about the rest of the land, or most of the land, our case is that Jews got back to their land massively, particularly during the last 150 years, and they homesteaded most of it, which was nearly unpopulated and deserted land, and basically that is pure homesteading by modern day Jews. Now, why did they go back to Israel? Well, the idea is that they did so because the Jewish people never abandoned its wish, its desire to get back to the land of which they were expelled about 1400 years ago. Because although the exile began with the Roman destruction of Jerusalem, and then the Bar Kokhba revolt failed and the Romans won, actually it was when the Arabs got to the land of Israel around the 7th century where the Jews were actually massively expelled. And by the way, it's when the Temple Mount became the Al-Aqsa Mosque and etc., right? So the main point here that I'm trying to make is that Jews have always lived in Israel in small numbers, and they got back massively during the last 150 years, and they built the place. That's the classical liberal case for Israel. Now, the argument of the Kohanim is made because it explains why the Jews got back, because they never stopped believing and demanding to live in that land, which they identify as theirs. That's why they got back, but that's not why they should be the proper owners. They are the proper owners because they built it during the last specifically 100 years. So that is the main thing. The development of the area, the cultivation of lands, the true homesteading of the place. It's convenient for Hoppe and other libertarian anti-Zionists to claim that our entire argument is something that we actually make of a very specific property in the area, which is the Temple Mount. But it's very significant. Otherwise, we wouldn't do so, because the Palestinian Arab national propaganda says that the Jews have no connection to the land, that they are European settler colonialists. And so if you don't understand the relation between the Jewish people and their history and their tradition with the land of Israel, it doesn't make any sense for them to want it to go back there. But it's important, which is why we mention it. But of course, the idea that we base our entire argument on that is absurd, and it is a severe distortion of what we are actually saying.
Let me add to what Alan has said. it's a dispute between Arabs and Israelis or Arabs and Jews over land. And the way that libertarians look at this is homesteading. Who is the proper owner? And the proper owner is the first homesteader. And our claim is that not that Jews own all of it and Arabs own none of it, but that the Jews own a lot of it. Now, our problem with Hans Hoppe on this question is that what he does is he tries to undermine the Jewish claim to land. And we admit the Jewish claim to land is not perfect. And all he does is say, well, it's no good. But he never talks about the Arab claims for land, and he never compares them. And Murray Rothbard wrote this War Guilt in the Middle East, I think it was in '67, and he asks us not to be sectarians. What's a sectarian? A sectarian is someone who says, well, all governments are evil and libertarians just don't take any position. And Murray warns against this, and he says, the question is not who is perfect. Nobody's perfect. The question is who has a better claim. And what we're trying to say is that the Jews have a much better claim to a lot of the land than do the Arabs. And what Hans Hoppe is saying is, well, the Jewish claims are problematic, and he never talks about the Arab claims. So he's not doing a comparative analysis, which we think, following Murray Rothbard, is very important. But the land claims are only part of the entire issue. The homesteading is only a part of it. Another part of it is hatred of Jews. A lot of people say, well, the reason the Arabs are upset is because of the State of Israel. But the State of Israel only came in 1948. But long before 1948, there were pogroms of Arabs just killing Jews because there's a lot of Jew hatred. And we want to make sure that this also gets put on the table and is part of the analysis.
You two are both economists. And economics, some say, is the question of what is the alternative? Not the utopian solution, but the alternative. And it sounds like one of your counterparts in the industry, Hans Hoppe, doesn't address that vital question. Let's look at another challenge that's been thrown your way. Kevin Duffy, the crux of this debate seems to come down to this. Futterman and Block are comparing Arab and Jewish land claims, battle tactics, treatment of civilians, etc., and finding in favor of the latter. With land claims, there's an excellent article that refutes the biblical land claims. It's the history of Palestine from Canaan through the Mandate era. And it's by Jeremy Hammond. So, who gets to adjudicate over these claims? Duffy says. Right now, it looks like a case of might makes right, especially to the losing side. With battle tactics, Israel came about by terrorist tactics, the Irgun, the Stern Gang. In fact, Duffy says the Irgun was the model for the PLO. If Israel denounces the killing of civilians, which it should, it must face up to its own sordid history. He goes on from land claims and battle tactics to the treatment of civilians. On October 7th, the Palestinians of Gaza, not all Hamas, killed 1,200 Israelis, roughly 300 military targets, and took 240 hostages. Since that time, Israel's killed 40,000 while claiming about only one-third were Hamas. That's 1 in 50 Gazans killed in 6 months, plus the destruction of at least 70% of buildings, a continued blockade and severe restrictions on humanitarian aid. Statistics on civilian deaths in this conflict have been kept since, I believe, 2000, and they show Palestinian deaths outnumber Israel by over 10 to 1. What do you say to Kevin Duffy? Walter, how about you take this one first?
I'm now going to come at you, Josh. Here is a knife. It's actually a pen, but it's make-believe it's a knife. And I yell at you, I'm going to kill you. And I'm rushing towards you, and your back is to the wall. There's no way for you to run. We're in a narrow corridor, so you can't dodge around me. You happen to have a gun. And also, these are pictures of my grandchildren on this cup. But I'm holding a real live grandchild right here. And the only way you can save your life, Josh, is by killing me. Because I'm determined, I've got blood in my eye, I'm going to kill you. I don't like you. I don't like the cut of your jib, or whatever the reason is. And the only way you can save your life is to shoot me. However, I've got my grandson right here, God forbid. And the only way you can shoot me is right through him. Whose fault is it that my grandson dies? Is it my fault or your fault? Well, I think it's my fault. I shouldn't have him there. What the Hamas does is it embeds itself in the civilian population, and it uses the civilian population as a shield. And the only way that the Israelis can get Hamas is to have collateral damage. Naftali Bennett, a former prime minister of Israel, said that if it were not for this, the war would have lasted 3 days. I think he's too extreme. I think it would have been 6 days, because we have precedent for 6 days. If there were no embeddedment of Hamas in the civilian population, and if there were no using people as shields, the war would have been over in 6 days. The fact is that the war took so long because of Israeli concern about collateral damage. Who else drops before bombs? They drop leaflets. And the leaflets say, go away, because we're going to bomb this place. Who else puts rocket launchers in hospitals? Who else puts rocket launchers in schools? And then, the Israelis are not supposed to defend themselves because the rocket launcher is in the middle of a hospital and you have to leave it sacrosanct? Look, yes, there are more. I don't know about the exact numbers. Those numbers come from Hamas, and who knows about the veracity of the numbers. But let's stipulate that they're true. The question is not who is bearing more debts, and by stipulation, the Arabs are more than the Jews. Only 1,200 totally innocent people were killed. The question is, whose fault is it? And just as it's my fault that my grandson or my son is right in front of me and I'm using him as a shield, it's the fault of Hamas that these deaths are occurring. It sounds horrible, 50-1 deaths, which was Duffy's rough numbers. But the much more important question is not the numbers, but whose fault is it? And it's the fault of Hamas that those people are dying. That would be my response to Duffy.
Alan?
Yes, just to add a few. Those are lots of points that Duffy makes, and regarding the land dispute or the land ownership, we are not making a claim based on biblical grounds. I mean, we don't do that in our book or in our papers or in our articles about it. We simply don't do that. Now, with regard to land ownership, there are many different estimates of the land that was owned by Arabs and Jews at the time. And you could go for Jews between 7 and 11%. You could go for Arabs for 20%, 30%. Even, of course, anti-Zionists claim even up to about 45, 48%. But not even them claim that the Arabs owned most of the land. So I think, or a large majority of the land, not even them do that. So the question again is, why do we have to accept the claim that it was Arab land? And then when you get into the status of the land titles at the time, which we do in our book mainly, in chapter 2, 3, and I think 7, if I'm not mistaken, most of the land was regarded as uncultivatable, as Walter said, but that included much of the titles to which Arabs had claim. And at the same time, there was very low development in the area. So many of those titles, which were actually government concessions, were not private property on a Western sense, nor were they based on homesteading. So the idea is, who owns something? Well, according to the libertarian tradition, John Locke, you have to work the land in order to own it. Much of it that was regarded as Arab was not owned by them in that sense. It was government concessions. But all things said, Jews did not own most of the land. Arabs did not own most of the land. It was governments that owned most of the land, whether Ottoman or British. So, I mean, that's number one. It was not Arab land. Any of those two communities could have created a political entity at the time based on the land that they get to purchase and homestead according to classical liberalism, which is the philosophy that we are using here. One has also to remember that 2/3 of the historical, more than 2/3 actually, of the historical land of Palestine was given away by the British to the Hashemite kingdom in order to create Jordan. So it was not the case that the Jews got all of Palestine, or so-called Palestine. That's not the case. Even the partition plan that was based by the UN, that was based on demographic considerations, gave the Jews roughly half of the 1/3 that remained in the hands of the British after they gave the other 2/3 to Jordan, right, to create Jordan. So what is the idea here? That Jews had no right whatsoever to create their own commonwealth, their own country, but Arabs did. Again, I mean, where is this coming from? You either have to recognize that both had a right, let's say Jews on 5%, 7%, 10%, 11%, whatever you want. And if you want 90%, even most of it was owned by the government. Let's say that it went to the Arabs. Jews would have accepted that offer. I'm sure. Not it doesn't sound very fair, but they would have, because previously to 1947, Jews accepted worse offers than they were given at the time. So, but Arabs did not. Well, the same happened in 47. So, the idea is not how big Israel is, who owns or who does not own most of the land. As we said, it's the rejection of Jewish presence in the area. It's the rejection of Israel. Everything else it's simply an excuse. Now, what Duffy mentions with regard to the asymmetric nature of civilian casualties on one side and the other, it doesn't make a difference, because in every military conflict, you have an aggressor and you have a victim that is being aggressed. And you need to identify who the aggressor is. It has not been Israel. Throughout history, Israel was attacked over and over again. Of course, Duffy will think otherwise, but it's not a matter of opinion, basically, because, for example, again in 47, several Arab nations invaded the newly born state of Israel. What do you think would have happened? They say, well, there was ethnic cleansing of Arabs in Israel. Well, 20% of Israel's population today is Arabs with full Israeli citizenship. And on the other hand, there are almost no Jews in Arab countries. They were ethnically cleansed and expropriated there, about 1 million of them. So you could extrapolate from that to the idea of thinking as a mind exercise, right? What would have happened if the Arabs would have won in 48 instead of Israel? Jews would have been ethnically cleansed, to say the least. Hundreds of thousands of them would have been murdered, likely. So, I mean, again, compared to what is what you just said? Anti-Zionists and libertarian anti-Zionists, they focus obsessively on Israel, but they don't see what's on the other side. and they don't weigh properly, I think, the real alternatives on the ground, whether in history or right now. It's as if, well, the alternative is to for the state of Israel to disappear and everything would be privatized and free markets would reign and private property rights, and everyone, instead of reading the Hamas charter that calls for the mass murder of Jews, they would be all reading John Locke and Murray Rothbard. It's insane. So it cannot be used in order to assess which part is guilty and which part isn't in a given conflict. Otherwise, what are you going to do? You're going to support Nazi Germany because more civilians died on their side than on the side of other allies at the time. It's ridiculous. I don't see a way to convince Duffy on this, but at least this is what I have to say.
Glenn Greenwald. He says, whatever you thought of Israel in the past, believing that it was some kind of bastion of liberal democracy in the Middle East, that it was surrounded by primitive, brutal enemies, all the propaganda, what's clear now is that Israel is something quite different than all of that. And even people who once believed that are now starting to come and see that Israel is an apartheid rogue terrorist state. And if seeing the Israeli military gun down children on a Gazan beach in 2014 while they played soccer, or end the life of a journalist on purpose who's wearing a press jacket by putting a bullet in him through a sniper doesn't show you what the Israeli government really is, what will?
If the state of Israel would be in a process to commit genocide, Gaza would not be at this point. It would have lasted hours. And you could see it clearly in the following way. There are many developments, recent developments, where we see that the casualties figure was reduced recently. And so you see about, let's say, 25,000 people killed, of which 14,000 were Hamas terrorists. And that ratio is better than almost any other similar conflict, military conflict in history. This has been mentioned by several people that know about this subject at this point. But in any case, what this shows is that there is no, precise idea in order to assess what is going on indiscriminately. And they murdered 1,200 people in a day. Israel, it's been like 6 months in the operation, and they killed 24,000, of which 14,000 are Hamas terrorists. And so it's obvious that Israel is doing whatever it can in order to reduce civilian casualties. Because of course, any person of goodwill in the world don't want to see people dying, and war is horrible, and what is going on is terrible. It's a human tragedy, of course. But who is responsible for that? It's Hamas. Hamas places and hides among civilians in order to attack civilians, Israeli civilians. So the focus is, instead of being placed on Hamas, is being placed on Israel. For example, what you quoted of Greenwald. He's mentioned 2 cases, right? Which, let's say that the IDF did wrong then. It's not a systematic policy. Of course, you could point out to any military in the world, in conflict and outside of military conflict, that makes mistakes. The point is if that is the official policy or not. It's obvious that the official policy of the State of Israel is not to commit genocide. Figures prove it, but it is the official policy of Hamas to commit genocide. Intent is there. What they lack is capabilities. But if the military power would be reversed and Hamas would have the military power of the IDF, you could bet that they would use it full force against Israeli civilians, and they would kill everyone there. But for some reason, this is something that's ignored, and the focus again is obsessively placed on Israel. I don't know, Walter, if you would like to add something.
To your knowledge, if we were to pressure test that point, Alan, has there ever been an instance historically where Arab countries have possessed the power to eviscerate Israel?
Right.
Has there ever been an example where such power was possessed among the Arab states, yet they exercised restraint?
Never. They always, for example, let's say the 67 war. The Syrian and the Egyptians had a very significant military power, in some respects above Israel. What Israel had better at the time was a better military intelligence that allowed them to attack in a certain way as to be extremely effective in nullifying the military capabilities of Syria and Egypt. But it was not the case that there was no existential danger. Quite actually, there was. And there was fear that Israel would lose that war. Of course, aided by military intelligence, of which we know, for example, Eli Cohen in the case of Syria, that he got very good intelligence, but at the same time, others received good intelligence and gained good intelligence in Egypt as well. That's what made Israel to win the war pretty fast and pretty effectively. But you are talking about military capabilities, and they had great military capabilities.
If what Greenwald says is true, that the IDF killed a bunch of soccer-playing boys, or a journalist who was clearly marked as a journalist, well, we just say the IDF is imperfect. They were wrong. They shouldn't have done this. But in the natural order of things, this is picayune, or very, very small compared to 1,200 people. And this isn't the first time. There have been pogroms every 10, 20 years or so. I wanted to also mention one of my favorite cartoons. One of my favorite cartoons has an Israeli guy with a gun and a Hamas guy with a gun and two baby carriages. And one of the baby carriages has got a Jewish star on it, and the other baby carriage indicates that it's an Arab baby. And look at the positioning of these four figures. What you've got is the Israeli IDF fighter in front of his baby carriage, and the Arab fighter behind the Arab baby carriage. In other words, the Arabs are fighting behind their baby carriages, and the Israelis are fighting in front of their baby carriages. And, they say, what is it? A picture says 1,000 words, and a moving picture says 1,000 pictures. Well, this cartoon, I don't know how many words it says, but it says a lot. It says what's going on here. And what Greenwald picks is one or two cases of, if it's true, and I don't know whether it is true or not, but I am sort of a fan of Greenwald on many other areas, so I'll take what he says is true. The Israelis should be condemned for that. But to put this into some sort of context, as the president of Harvard is always harping on about context, he's context dropping. He's looking at something very small, and there's something gigantic staring him in the face, and he's not looking at that. It should be a comparative analysis. No one is saying that the IDF is perfect. No one is. Alan and I are not saying Jews are perfect. God knows we certainly disagree with many Jews on many issues. But you have to, as you said, economists look at the alternatives. And yes, the Israelis are imperfect. Sue us. I'm now making myself to be an Israeli, which I'm not. But if I were, sue us. Okay, we're wrong. We made mistakes. But the mistakes that we made are tiny compared to the gargantuan mistakes
and maybe they're not mistakes. It's on purpose.
Yeah, it sounds like perhaps the egregious violence on one hand could be said to be a bug, and on the other, a feature. So let's
Absolutely. Let me just add, Josh, one thing that I think it's important. But most of them, those who make this case, are not, definitely not, because they are obsessively focused on mistakes, errors, and wrong policies that could be pursued or done by the state of Israel in order to justify the disappearance of a country that in practical terms would entail mass murder on a gigantic scale. Like, we're talking about millions of people. That's the only alternative. And that is what these people are defending, those who would make that hypothetical opposite
Let's
case.
look at one of these people, Caitlin Johnstone. Zionism doesn't work. It was tried, and it turns out it doesn't work. If the forced existence of your artificial ethno-state requires ceaseless war and the periodic massacring of a large number of children, then your plan for your artificial ethno-state isn't working out and a new plan is needed. And Caitlin goes on to say, when something scary and traumatizing happens, more and more people are beginning to ask why. Why did that happen? What were the antecedents which led those people to do what they did? When people start asking these questions, answers are revealed, which are very inconvenient for the information interests of the Western Empire. It turns out Israel is an abusive apartheid state and Gaza a giant concentration camp where Palestinians are deprived of basic human needs. Alan, you want to lead off on this one?
Yes, well, I think Zionism is pretty successful. It is a country that, despite being attacked over and over and over again with several wars, not only overcame the wars, but also turned into a very vibrant society, a very thriving society, which, by the way, it's also an example of entrepreneurial capitalism. It's not an example of a perfect, laissez-faire capitalism, but it is an example of a society and an economy that creates wonderful things for humanity and as a whole. There is this book by Dan Zinner and Saul Singer, Startup Nation, and there are others similar to that book that tell the story of many companies, many entrepreneurs, and it's an entire ecosystem in Israel. And it has the standard of living of a Western developed country. So I don't see where is the failure. At the same time, it's not true that Israel requires war by itself, because many of the Arab countries that used to oppose Israel now have peace treaties with Israel, especially after the Abraham Accords, but even before, Egypt, Jordan. And so there is peace there. There is no love, if you will, but you don't need love in international relations to avoid war. You need respect, and that's it. At the same time, the part of those who hate Israel in the area are essentially, let's say, 5, 6, 7 players, all of them guided by Iran, and you have others that support them, like Qatar, Turkey, and of course you have Hezbollah, you have Hamas, but it's not the case that everyone hates Israel in the area. So it's not true that it's either a failure or that it entails violence. Quite the opposite. When Israel is not attacked, there is peace. And there is a complete, it's the entire thing is completely out of proportion. It's a very small country with a very little population that's living there. We're not talking about a country with 100 million people. It's about 10 million people. And the area, it's huge. If you try to find Israel in a map, it's difficult to find it, particularly if you take into account the entire Arab world. So the entire thing is completely out of proportion. At the same time, when 500,000 people are killed as a consequence of the Syrian civil war, just a few kilometers to the north in Israel, nobody seems to care. Does this person think that let's say the entire idea of Arab countries and Arab societies are a failure, or that they have been tried but didn't work? I mean, these things are only said about the Jewish state. Another thing is, for example, the concentration camp, Gaza as the concentration camp. Well, but if that is the case, do you think that you would focus in who is governing the Gaza Strip? It is an Islamist totalitarian dictatorship by Hamas. That is certainly a jail, because it's a regime that does not allow freedom of expression, freedom of religion, freedom of association, that kills people for their preferences and their ideologies and their political views. Well, in that sense, it is a jail, but not because of Israel. Even the so-called blockade, which it was an arms blockade because goods flew in and out of the Gaza Strip since Hamas took over in 2007, and even people, because, for example, more than 20,000 people had work permits in Israel from Gaza. Some of them gave intelligence to Hamas, unfortunately. What I'm trying to say with this is that the entire idea that the Gaza Strip was completely sealed, and it's insane. I mean, to this day, Hamas was able to amass such amount of weapons that they are still launching rockets to Israel after 6 months of war, and everything they say about the IDF destroying everything. I mean, they are still attacking Israel. They are still retaining hostages. And so what else could be said about this? It's completely out of proportion, which is a feature of anti-Zionist mentality.
Let me hop onto the shoulders of Alan in this regard on the quote that you read. First, the apartheid business. This is South Africa. How did the white majority treat the blacks in South Africa? Is it comparable at all with how Israel treats its Arab population? No. There are Arab citizens who have equal rights with the Jews in Israel. They are policemen. They are judges. They have a political party, and the political party sits in the Knesset. There are professors who are Arab in the Israeli universities. None of this occurred with the black people in South Africa. So the charge of apartheid is just silly. The concentration camp business, I mean, we have precedent for concentration camps, real concentration camps. And they were not in Israel, they were in Germany. And to say that what occurred in Gaza was similar to that is highly problematic. Let me be diplomatic here. Look, in 2005, the Israeli government ordered all the Jews in Gaza to leave. There was an election, and Hamas won the election. I think it was in 2007. You know, people are saying, well, there should be a Palestinian state. There was a Palestinian state, sort of, in Gaza in 2007 and thereafter. And what did this Palestinian state do? Did they build hotels? No. Did they build salinization plants? No. Did they build underground tunnels? Oh, yeah. They built underground tunnels from which to attack Israel. Did they build rocket launching apparatus in hospitals? Yes. So you had a concentration camp. If it was a concentration camp, as Alan said, the fault of it was not Israel. The fault of it was Hamas. If Hamas had been peaceful, rational, they could have been the Hong Kong of the Middle East. Israel would have helped them. Israel would have traded with them. Israel allowed people to come in on work permits, and they could earn more money in Israel than they could earn in Gaza when there's relative peace. So the idea that there was a concentration camp is ludicrous. Yes, there were restrictions on what could go in to Gaza because what was going in was military stuff. And Israel is right next door and didn't much like military stuff going in there. I mean, the cement that went in there could have been used for buildings. Instead, it was used for tunnels. So the whole idea of Gaza being a concentration camp, if there's any truth of it, it's the fault of Hamas, not Israel. And there is no truth of it from the point of Israel. Israel did not make them any sort of concentration camp. Israel offered them a quasi-state, a quasi-government, in effect, a Palestinian state they had there, but they used it in a way that just undermined everything decent.
Yeah, just one addition. I mean, the October the 7th was the last explosion of hatred that the Hamas regime showed. But in reality, since they took over the Gaza Strip after a civil war with the Palestinian Authority, which nobody seems to care about much, but it happened, they took over the Gaza Strip, and every 2 years or so, there was an Israeli operation in order to make Hamas cease firing rockets on Israeli civilians. They launched tens of thousands of rockets against Israeli civilians for more than a decade, actually close to 2 decades now. So it's not that this is something new and that Hamas was like, they were saints, but on October the 7th, they saw that they actually wanted to commit genocide. No. When they get enough capabilities and they get to apply their real plan, they do so, whether with October the 7th or with massive rocket launching, you name it. And so this idea that, the situation was impossible. You had this regime in Gaza, and at the same time, the anti-Zionist says, well, but, I think you were going to ask about this, Josh. This idea that Israel created Hamas. Well, actually, Hamas is a creation of followers of the Muslim Brotherhood. And it is funded primarily by Iran, Qatar, and Turkey. And Israel had no choice, according to the situation in the area, but to continue allowing financing flows to Hamas for Hamas to be able to govern the place. Israel had to provide healthcare. Israel had to provide electricity to the strip. Several measures that anti-Zionists take as if Israel was like promoting Hamas in a sense. But the alternative to doing that was to do what Israel is doing now, which is trying to destroy Hamas. So there is no way out of it for the anti-Zionist mentality. Israel is always wrong. And for them, for anti-Zionists, it's like Palestinian Arabs have no agency. They are not responsible for anything. And this is not how it works. Hamas was there because it was elected. But moreover, most of the Palestinian Arabs support Hamas, according to the polls. And so this is something that is never mentioned, but it's important to understand that this deep-seated hatred against the Jews, against Israel, is the entire source of the conflict, and that it is Hamas that is causing it. But Hamas didn't came out of nowhere. It was elected by the Palestinian Arabs, and at the same time, Israel had to deal with it. The anti-Zionists will say, well, no, Israel is promoting Hamas. Israel promoted Hamas. But how did Hamas get there in the first place? And what the alternative, again, compared to what? What is it that you're going to do? Israeli politicians decided to, every 2 years or so, launch a defensive operation to reduce the military capabilities of Hamas, and to, with the Iron Dome, to believe that nothing was really happening because, okay, they launched their rockets, but the Iron Dome destroys them in the air, so nothing happens. This status quo, right? Well, this status quo exploded on October the 7th, when it was crystal clear that this dynamics could not continue. But the entire thing is, or the essential thing, is that at least for the anti-Zionist mentality, every mistake, error, or horrible act committed by Palestinian Arabs is to be blamed on Israel. And everything that Israel does, forced by a specific situation, that actually benefits Palestinian Arabs, for example, providing them with electricity to the Gaza Strip, is interpreted as an action that promotes the evil that they see in the Palestinian society, the Palestinian Arab society, but they try to blame Israel anyway. So it's the obsession, it's something that it's truly unbelievable.
They've supported all sorts of feminist stuff and gay organizations and other woke efforts. And what has been the response of these people? Well, you have queers for Palestine. I mean, if a gay person went over to Gaza and said he was gay, they'd kill him. They'd throw him off a roof. The feminists, how have they reacted? Well, I mean, there was rapes. And the feminists are supposed to be against rape. And yet the feminist movement has not been front and center in supporting of Israel. If anything, the very opposite. So a lot of Jews now are rethinking their knee-jerk reaction of supporting the Democratic Party and supporting left-wing-ism. And I hope that this process will continue. I think that Jews can comfortably be relied upon to vote, 85% for the Democratic Party. Hopefully in the next election that's coming up in the United States in November, this number will decrease, hopefully radically, when Jews realize who their friends are. And their friends are not on the left. Yes, there are right-wing neo-Nazis also who are not really friendly to Jews also. We get it from both sides. But you asked about blacks and Jews, and that would be my reaction. And then there's this Biden thing about, if you're black and you don't vote for me, you're not really black. Now, there are some of my favorite theoreticians, Thomas Sowell, Walter Williams, Jason Riley, are, the idea is somehow if you're black, you have to be a socialist, which is preposterous. But these guys, Sowell and Williams and these other black free enterprises, they're obviously black and they're obviously not socialists, so they call them Oreo cookies because they're not authentically black. They're white on the inside because they favor free enterprise. This is preposterous, and yet this is what goes on at universities.
Let's hear his perspective. Hamas tried to provoke an aggressive response from Israel and used that response to rally Muslims worldwide for the cause of Palestine. They succeeded. Israel should engage in the most conspicuous acts of kindness ever possible. That would thwart the goals of Hamas.
Well, Elon changed his view after saying that. And I think that's all one could say about it, because, he presented that case first, but then he realized that Hamas was not, turning the other cheek. And no, they would, quite the opposite. Any sign of goodwill on the part of Israel is understood as a sign of weakness, and therefore as an invitation to more murder and more violence. So that's why I think he changed his mind.
But as Alan very accurately said, in the Middle East, it's a rough neighborhood. And if you turn the other cheek, it's seen as weakness, and they pounce on you even the more.
Ron Unz, what does he say? The number of unarmed Israeli civilians killed by Hamas militants might have been a little more than 100. 40 babies were claimed to be beheaded. 0 babies were beheaded. 40 babies were claimed to be killed. 1 baby was killed. And it's not even known by whom. A baby, it's claimed, was cut out of its mother's stomach and then the mother was murdered. He says it didn't happen. Israelis are projecting here. If you study them, they project constantly. What do you say to Ron Unz?
Well, I'm not gonna comment on the nonsense, but what I'm going to comment on is on the mentality. It goes like this: anything that happens to an Israeli, you have to do a PhD type research in order to check if it was the case or it wasn't. But on the other hand, if Hamas says something about another thing that happened 2 minutes ago, we have to take it as if it would be dogma in the Bible. The anti-Zionist mentality cannot conceive of anything wrong or evil happening against Jews without Jews being the ultimate people to be blamed for it. So if something happens against the Jews, well, nothing actually can happen. Nothing bad can happen to the Jews, because everything that is bad has its origin on the Jews. Every evil is ultimately originated by the Jews. So how could something evil or horrible happen to the Jews? There is only one way: if Israel is involved. And so another type of argument close to the one you read is that the IDF killed most of the people on October the 7th, the most of civilians on October the 7th. That's another variant of the same type of argument. And so, but the underlying argument is what I just said. Nothing good comes out of the Jews. Everything bad comes from the Jews. And if you have to make it one step further, you'd say that the enemies of the Jews can do no bad, can do no wrong. Everything they do, it's good. Even if it's horrible. And if it's horrible, then the Jews are to blame, ultimately. This is how this type of mentality works.
Western media hasn't explained what sparked the bloody Hamas attack on Jewish settlements around Gaza. I visited and interviewed some of the Jewish settlers. The attacks around Gaza were sparked by recent actions of Israel, Israel's new ultra-right-wing coalition government. For years, Israel's rightist politicians and government have been promoting the expansion of legal and illegal settlements on Palestinian land, particularly around Gaza. These fortified settlements were designed to surround and isolate Gaza and prevent the creation of a contiguous Palestinian state. The settlements and outposts were filled with militant settlers who were heavily armed and hated Palestinians.
But it doesn't make any sense because, as Walter mentioned, 2005, the state of Israel expelled all Jews from Gaza. So it doesn't make any sense. And about the Jewish towns, which are called settlements in Judea and Samaria, otherwise known as the West Bank, most of them are built on virgin lands that are not homesteaded. So what would be the problem? Now, the people that make this type of arguments say, okay, if in the future there is a Palestinian Arab state, it should be free of Jews, because that's the underlying argument. But there is no need for this to happen. There's no necessity, in very much the same way that there are Arab citizens of Israel and there are Arab towns and cities in Israel. Imagine if we would be making that claim. If we would say there should be no Arab towns in Israel. What would you think about that? But conversely, if someone says There's how can you conceive that there will be Arab towns in a Palestinian Arab state, Jewish towns in a Palestinian Arab state, and somehow that makes more sense? It's ridiculous.
I would add, who started these fights? And I would answer, not the Jews, not the settlers. The settlers are guilty of stopping at a red light or at a stop sign, and then they get shot at by the Arabs in the Judea and Samaria. So it's a question of who started the fight, and that's the person who's responsible for it. And as for contiguity, if there were peace, there could be a Gaza and the West Bank, Samaria and Judea. There is precedent for that. There was, Bangladesh and Pakistan. So you could have a government, or you could have two separate governments if there were peace. But there's no peace. There's a lot of Jew hatred, and people who are starting these things are the Arabs, not the Jews. Again, I resort to that quote from Netanyahu: "If Israel put down its arms, there'd be no Israel and no Jews. If the Arabs put down their arms, there'd be peace." They don't want peace. Jew hatred is the key.
Walter Allen, do you have a theory as to why all the exercised objections around Israel and its need to return land aren't paralleled by such exercised objections to the Arab states who've dispossessed Jews from land throughout the Arab world? Or are people up in arms about that? Where's the right of return? Give back the property. I've not heard that argument, actually, I think, from a single person.
Well, let me jump in on this and say, first of all, we promised you an hour and a half, and we've got 4 more minutes, so we're going to have to come to a halt, and this might well be the last question. And I'd like to thank you for a magnificent interview of us. Let me just say that in 1947, 1948, a lot of Arabs left Israel. Part of it, they were afraid of the war. Part of it, they were following the orders of the 5 armies that were invading and saying, leave for a week or 2, we'll mop up all the Jews and then you can come back, whereas if you stay, it'll be harder for us to kill them all. At that same time, about 900,000 or 1 million Jews were kicked out of the Arab countries. One would have thought there'd be some sort of switcheroo, that all the Arabs who were dispossessed from Israel would take up the Jewish property in the Arab countries, and the Jews would take over their property. But no. The right of return was only one-sided. And this is part and parcel of the course, or whatever it is, one-sidedness. There was no reciprocity involved in it.
Why do you suppose that asymmetry exists? Why aren't people more vocal about the right of return or some compensation to those who've been dispossessed of their land throughout the Arab worlds?
I could tell you that why, because it's the problem of the Palestinian Arab refugees. It's an excuse to oppose Israel. That's why nobody cares about the Arab Jewish refugees from Arab countries, because it's not the point is not the refugees. Even if the refugee problem would be solved, which in fact mostly is, because these people, those who after 48, many of the Arabs who left ended up in Judea and Samaria, West Bank, and in Gaza. Others went to other countries, but they continued, they moved on with their lives. The ones that remained in the West Bank and in Gaza, they remained in refugee camps that today are cities. Now, why they were in refugee camps first? Because the Arab countries, the Arab states, wanted them to be eternal refugees in order to perpetuate the problem, in order to attack Israel. And that's why they treated Palestinian Arabs as second-class citizens in many countries, in many Arab countries. That's a fact that anti-Zionists don't talk about either.
It looks like we are coming to the end of what I believe is an extraordinarily enlightening series of discussions. Thank you again both for your time, and I look forward to being in touch.